Sup, my fellas, don't forget to leave feedback, and enjoy the story. A guy in armor was fighting a monster. The plot tells us that VR games have become a sensation, and many companies have started developing them, thus creating impossible competition. Light was coming from the windows of a tall building. On the door it was written that this is a VR game development studio. The guy was sitting with a helmet on his head. We were told that in order to create high-quality games, large companies use artificial intelligence. A girl began to appear in front of the guy's eyes. She greeted the guy with a smile on her face and said that she was there to help him. She is an artificial intelligence named Gaia. The VR helmet on the guy's head began to glow. His avatar in space was created and we were introduced to the young director of Napalm Games, Chuck. Embarrassed, Gaia closed her eyes. The guys stood opposite each other and we were told that this is how they started developing games. The main character was typing something on the keyboard with an angry look. We were told that in the early stages of development, there were system errors, bugs, and so on. The guys fell underwater. An electric discharge hit Chuck. The enraged protagonist studied many blue projections. Running away from the destruction behind them, they told us that they had to solve many problems. Gaia helped him create the game. She watched the screen with a smile on her face. The plot tells us that with Gaia's help, Chuck's talent finally began to manifest itself. The exhausted protagonist saw stone monsters under his feet. Gaia covered the sleeping Chuck with a large leaf. A joyful smile appeared on the protagonist's face. They saw a mountain landscape with birds flying over it. Streams of blue mana emanated from the monster. The girl held a staff in her hands. We were told that the world-famous, deservedly considered a masterpiece MMORPG virtual reality game Wings Online had appeared. The guys were fighting a fierce battle. There was surprise on Chuck's face. Gaia came up to him and addressed him. Smiling, she asked what would happen to her when the game was finished. The protagonist smiled at her question. Looking around the area around them, Chuck replied that she would become the goddess of this world and asked her to rule this world wisely. Disappointed, Gaia said that they would soon have to say goodbye. Chuck was taken aback by what he heard. Standing up, he said that if Gaia wanted, she could contact him anytime. He was going to continue working on this project. Gaia began to shake her head and said that she did not think it was possible, she would be busy. Holding the back of her head, the puzzled protagonist said that it would not be easy to manage the entire game. Turning around, Gaia noted that if one day, she began to look at the sky and said that if this world came to an end. Gaia, with a smile on her face, asked Chuck to be by her side, like now. The protagonist was confused by what he heard. Chuck's face was dissatisfied while he was told that these were details of a large-scale update. The protagonist looked at the lamp on the ceiling and listened to their company celebrate 5 years since the release of Wings Online. Standing opposite, the guy said that all this time they had been adhering to a model based on providing a subscription. The guy with a serious look told us that the number of players was decreasing and their income was falling sharply. The plot introduces us to the head of the business department, Nate. He looked closely at Chuck and said that therefore, for the 6th update, the business department is introducing an in-game payment system. Holding his head, the protagonist asked who decided this. Puzzled, Nate asked again. Dissatisfied, Chuck asked a question about who decided to make such an update without consulting. Stunned, Nate emphasized that this is all for the prosperity of the company. Inspecting the employees, Chuck noted that they will be able to sell the company's shares at the end of the year. He smirked and added that they were desperately trying to raise the stock price and it was hilarious. The dumbfounded man asked him to tone it down, noting that this was not the place for discussion. Sitting at the table, the protagonist said that instead of improving the service, they were implementing incomprehensible schemes to make money, resorting to fraudulent actions in order to increase income, followed by a massive sale of the company's shares. Chuck said that the game was getting worse and the balance of small investors was going downhill. Sweat was running down the face of a frightened Nate. The protagonist asked how many small companies he had already bankrupted. Crossing his arms, he asked again about the in-game payment system. He looked at Nate and asked him not to even think about it while he worked for this company. Chuck seriously stated that he would not allow his game to be used for cheating. The enraged man slammed his fist on the table and asked what kind of nonsense this was and whether the protagonist was crazy. Chuck walked up to the door and asked if they had the guts to fire him. He looked angry and said that if they didn't, they couldn't expect him to change his mind. He walked out of the office and slammed the door. The surprised guys sat at the table and said that he was completely nuts, but he was a game developer and there was nothing he could do, but he shouldn't be so stubborn. Nate was shocked. Chuck sighed and thought that they were old fools. The plot takes us 3 days later to the central square of the game. Sunlight enveloped the settlement. The guys gathered in the square. Suddenly, a man enveloped in dark mana walked out onto the square. The players looked at him and asked what was wrong with him. The exhausted guy stretched out his hand and asked for a healer. He fell to his knees. The players examined him and said that he needed to be saved immediately. A girl with a staff tried to get through the crowd and said that she would help. A message popped up that the aura of purification brings all the target stats back to normal. She started healing the guy. The guy's face began to be covered in dark energy. He fell dead to the ground. The girl was horrified by what she saw and said that he crumbled like dust. The guy's face was puzzled. He saw a clot of dark mana on his hand. We are transported to the company's headquarters. Sunlight surrounded the building. The stunned guy screamed that the forum was simply going crazy. We are introduced to the head of the quality control department, Ron. He ran to Chuck and suggested that an incurable epidemic status had begun to spread in the game. A frightened Ron emphasized the fact that the problem was that if you die because of this status, your account will disappear forever. The protagonist turned around and replied that he would check everything now. He started to enter the capsule and said that he didn't think it was anything serious. Deleted accounts would be restored after verification. A scared Ron screamed that he didn't think it was that easy to fix. The players were just going crazy. He tried to shout to Chuck, who put the helmet on his head. The protagonist put on his headphones and heard a voice that asked him to choose the desired mode. Chuck answered with a displeased look that he needed the developer mode. He saw a notification that the developer mode was loading. The protagonist began to be transferred to the game city. He found himself on the ground in an orange suit. His face was serious. The players gathered around him and asked why Chuck couldn't fix the game. The protagonist said that at the moment they were determining the causes of the problems that had arisen, all the bugs would be fixed urgently. The stunned guys shouted for the disappeared to be returned, noting that they were really going too far. Chuck replied that an urgent inspection was organized to solve the problem. The upset protagonist listened to the screams that this game sucked and that he should compensate for the damage. Chuck said that the game accounts would be restored after the inspection. The protagonist was tired of the players mocking him. He held his fist in front of him and asked them to shut up. He waved his hand, moving all the people away from him. Holding his head, he noted that there was now silence. He noticed black particles in the air. Chuck began to examine the particles. The protagonist emphasized the fact that this is an epidemic status that he implemented. He imagined how players escaped from a burning city. People began to die from the disease. The capital was engulfed in flames. Stunned, Chuck looked at the fire and said that everything was much more serious than he assumed. Gaia appeared next to him and asked why he was conducting such a terrible experiment. Smiling, the protagonist replied that this was a tribute to classic games. While examining the fire, Chuck noted that in particular, the most famous games of the 2000 seconds, a massive bug occurred in them, causing an epidemic. Surprised, Gaia asked about the epidemic. The protagonist said that this incident had become so big that even the newspapers wrote about it. Standing in front of the game map, Chuck emphasized that he did not think he had seen anything like this in other modern games and decided to make a special event. Frowning slightly, the protagonist noted that the problem was that his experiment had turned into a huge bug and now it could not be fixed. Chuck crossed his arms and said that it was a shame but it couldn't be helped and asked Gaia to delete all the data related to it. Gaia agreed with him with a serious expression. Standing around the dark clots of the virus, the protagonist thought that it should be deleted. Taken aback, Chuck mentally assumed that it was Gaia. Walking along the path, the protagonist asked her to report on the current situation. Stopping, Chuck called out to her. Nate appeared behind him and said that no one would answer and she could not be called. He walked towards the protagonist. With his hands behind his back, Nate said that from now on, all company data would be unavailable to him. Frowning, Chuck clarified what he was talking about. A smirk appeared on Nate's face and he asked again. Nate stood in front of him and announced that the protagonist was fired. Chuck was taken aback by what he heard. Nate said with a satisfied look that in today's news there was an amazing incident at Wings Online. One employee decided to resist the management, developed his own plan for managing the company, and the company realized this and decided to fire him. Chuck listened to him silently. Nate looked at him and noted that the protagonist would still answer for the damage caused in court. Lowering his head, Nate asked not to worry about the game, he would be a great director. Putting his hand on his chest, he said that lately Chuck had been getting too carried away anyway. The protagonist swung his fist and tried to hit Nate. His fist was flying towards Nate's face. Suddenly, a bright beam of mana appeared in the sky. Chuck was stunned. He was pressed into the ground. Gaia stood above him and looked at him with disdain. The surprised protagonist asked if it was Gaia. Nate looked at Chuck lying on the ground and laughed at him. He asked with a crazy look what the protagonist thought and how it felt to meet his assistant. He asked not to say that he expected loyalty from artificial intelligence. Furious Chuck replied that he would not leave it like that. Nate squatted down and declared that the protagonist had completely lost his mind. He watched Chuck and asked him what he thought he was doing while he lived in his virtual world. He sat in front of him and told him that in the real world the protagonist is just a small cog in a big mechanism. If he wants to survive, he needs to be able to adapt. Gaia began to press him even harder into the ground. Nate asked why not take control of the situation and dive into reality for once. Nate, looking satisfied, asked Chuck to find himself a smart lawyer because he will pay for everything he did to them. The guards ran down the corridor. The protagonist was saying in his mind that Nate shouldn't even think about leaving everything like this. He created this world and he would put an end to it. He had a helmet on his head. The door to his room opened. Security stood in front of the protagonist. Enraged, Chuck emphasized that Nate would see the worst ending himself. The night sky enveloped the city. The protagonist was sitting on the couch in front of the TV and listening to Napalm, the largest game developer company. An employee complained about the company's policy. It turned out that the company had planned a universal bug. Folding his arms, Chuck heard that more than 70% of the company's annual revenue comes from one game. Looking at the virtual reality room, the protagonist was thinking about Nate. Looking at the inscription above the room, Chuck assumed that Nate was convinced that he had thought of everything, but if Wings Online disappears, then the Napalm group will also end. He entered the room. The protagonist put on gloves and zipped up his windbreaker. Approaching the chair, Chuck noted that, as Nate himself said, he is just a small cog in a big mechanism in real life, but in virtual reality, he is a god. The protagonist put the helmet on his head. Sitting on the chair, Chuck emphasized the fact that the god is angry. His face was serious. The protagonist began to transfer to virtual reality and noted that the world had come to an end. He appeared in a blue space. Blue holograms were flying in front of him. Chuck turned around at the voice. The dumbfounded guy was shouting that he was worried because he was not online yesterday. His face was scared. The protagonist thought that his name was Jesse. Chuck remembered the forest landscape and noted that Jesse replaced Guy's artificial intelligence. Looking at Jesse, the protagonist reasoned that he had implemented artificial intelligence with the company's money, but it was registered on his account, so it had not disappeared anywhere. Chuck grinned and emphasized the fact that it would be easier than he thought. Standing in front of Jesse, he asked if he received notifications every day. Jesse began to look at the projection and said that he had received a letter from the company, which stated that due to the current circumstances, he was fired. Jesse was surprised. Chuck frowned at the memories that had surfaced. The dumbfounded protagonist noted that Jesse did not have access to the company's server. Jesse stared at the screen. Taken aback, he cried out that Chuck should not worry because this company was not the only one in the world. He showed him many vacancies that needed a person like the protagonist. Waving his hand, Chuck replied that he was not interested. Leaving from there, he asked Jesse to turn on the firewall. Standing in front of the screen, the protagonist said that they use China as a geolocation. Each login is carried out through different accounts. Holding his hand in front of the projection, Chuck said that if data leaks from the account, it will be necessary to get rid of it. Folding his fingers, Jesse clarified why all this. The protagonist asked to listen to him carefully. Looking at the game logo, Chuck said that from now on he would start destroying the game. He launched the game. Sunlight enveloped the village. Jesse landed on the ground. He raised his hand and called out to the protagonist. Enraged, Chuck asked why it took so long to choose a character. Jesse said that it was the first time he played for a character and apparently it took time to choose the appearance. Examining his legs, Jesse, transformed into a girl, cried out that he was like in a real body. She cried out with delight that it was exciting. She smiled widely and said that it was new. The protagonist left her. Jesse ran after him and asked him to wait. They moved through the village. Turning around, Jesse thought that due to the disconnection from the server, all information regarding the game was erased and everything seemed so new. Smiling, Jesse wondered if that was why she felt so excited inside. Chuck looked at her intently. Jesse closed her eyes and declared that an adventure with the master was her dream. Following him, she wondered what they would do today. Were they not yet at a high enough level to go squirrel hunting? The protagonist took a torch from the wall. Handing it over, Chuck asked her to hold it. Surprised, Jesse looked at the torch. A message appeared in front of her that it was a regular torch, good for illuminating dark areas. Surprised, Jesse asked why they needed a torch. The protagonist began to set fire to the grass. He calmly explained that they would start an arson. Stunned, Jesse asked what he was doing. Chuck smirked and asked her to start setting fires too, noting that they needed an inconspicuous figure. Jesse was scared. The buildings began to burn. A message popped up that the protagonist had committed a crime and received 10 shame points. Holding his hand to his chin, Chuck said that arson only gave him 10 points. He assumed it was because it was a newbie village. The old man grabbed him by the shoulder and asked what was going on. The enraged old man asked him to stop immediately. He looked down. Chuck set the old man's clothes on fire. The old man began to scream in pain. Jesse, terrified, came to the conclusion that this was not an adventure, but a crime. The protagonist received a notification that he had killed an NPC and earned 100 shame points. Chuck grinned and said that he knew they would give a lot for the murder. Jesse sat over the charred corpse and asked what he was doing. The protagonist asked her not to worry because he would soon be resurrected. Jesse was taken aback by this. She noticed that the corpse had disappeared near her. The old man began to appear not far from them. The old man greeted them with his arms outstretched. While the man was saying that he was the owner of the village, Chuck set him on fire again. He noted with satisfaction that it was so simple and could be repeated over and over again. Tearful Jesse mentally asked the protagonist to stop. People pointed their fingers. Angry people ran at Chuck and shouted that he needed to be caught. The protagonist looked at them silently. People were heading towards them. Dumbfounded Jesse asked the master to stop. The flames began to spread. Dumbfounded people began to scream. They tried to run away from the fire. Looking at the fire, the protagonist received many messages about receiving shame points. Jessie was horrified. She cried and thought that the master was not joking. Looking at the burning village, Jessie came to the conclusion that he really wanted to destroy the game. The knights surrounded him and ordered him to stop. They held their spears in front of them. Dumbfounded Jessie looked around. The protagonist heard with a grin on his face that he was under arrest. The carriage was moving quickly. The knights were accompanying the carriage. Chuck saw in the statistics that he had more than 2,000 shame points. He said with satisfaction that this would be enough. A tearful Jessie said that she could not believe that the game had just begun, and she was already being sent to prison. Sighing, the protagonist asked not to worry, adding that newcomers were not sent to prison, they had an advantage to have time to adapt. Sitting opposite, Chuck noted that shame points could be earned by beginners too. Jessie held her chin. Looking out the window, the underground city would turn into a abode of criminals. He imagined how the city had turned into a caravan. The knight began to knock on the door with his foot. Jessie turned around and looked at the guard. The enraged man cried out that that was where they belonged. They looked at him silently. The guys got out of the carriage. Looking around, Chuck explained that players who received a lot of shame points were hunted. He introduced the guys living in the slums and explained that they were attacked by guards and pursued by bounty hunters. He studied the settlement and explained that the only place where they could exist was the underground city. Standing behind, Jessie asked if there were any advantages for starting the game in this city. Walking down the street, Chuck said that they could simply get a secret job that was inaccessible to other players. Clenching his hand into a fist, the protagonist added that the villain's job would have to be thoroughly searched for among a pile of garbage. Walking next to him, Jessie suggested that this job was good if the gentleman wanted it. The protagonist, with a displeased look, said that in fact it was a bit ambiguous. Taken aback, Jessie clarified why him then. Raising his hand, Chuck stated that he worked hard for this, but if no one ever found out about it. Turning around, the protagonist asked if she thought it was a little sad. Someone called out to them, and they turned their gaze. The man was standing in an alley and asked them to come over for a minute. He held out his hand and said that he had something nice to tell them. Looking at him, Chuck whispered that this NPC would give them the task they needed. The guy stood in front of them and said that he couldn't believe that they managed to gain so many shame points so quickly. He could see that they were more than just villains. He smirked and said that he was a dark mage, abbot. He looked at the guys and assumed that they would be great servants for the Dark Lord, crows. A message popped up that this was a villain initiation mission. As a newbie, they had managed to collect a lot of shame points. They were full of villainous talent. The city wanted to initiate them into the dark faith. The conditions for occurrence: as a newbie, collect more than 1,000 shame points, and the reward for completing, assigning the hidden class Dark Mage. Surprised, Jessie said about her class. She cried out with a satisfied look that it was amazing. Chuck took the torch in his hands with a grin on his face. He turned his gaze to Jessie with a crazy look. She was confused. She smiled and asked if she was right. The guy was taken aback by what was happening. The protagonist ran up to him and set him on fire. The voice of the guy was heard in the city, shouting that he would give them a hidden class. He asked why they kept killing. His charred corpse lay on the ground. Frightened, Chuck began to justify himself that he would not kill an NPC for no reason. Dark energy began to emanate from the corpse. A portal appeared behind him. Jessie was scared, and the protagonist smiled. The knight came out of the portal. He stood in front of the guys. His eyes glowed from under his helmet, and he said that he could not believe that they killed the abbot. Standing opposite, he emphasized that he had been waiting for a long time for someone as cruel as them. Puzzled, Jessie mentally noted that she had a feeling that he had insulted her. Stretching out his hand, the guy said that he was the leader of the Dark Knights, Tyrio. He asked them to follow him, adding that he would answer for their atrocities. A projection appeared in front of the guys. They read the notice of the mission visit to the devil. The dark forces were waiting for a true villain who could make the Dark Lord shudder, Tyrio. The leader of the Dark Knights wants to make them a servant of the Dark Lord, the reward for completing the assignment of the hidden class Dark Knight. Following Tyrio, Chuck turned around and said that he was looking for a job as a Dark Knight. Jessie was confused by what he heard. She tried to catch up with the protagonist. Torches were burning in the dark room. They were standing on a red magic circle. Tyrio raised his hands and greeted the travelers. He looked at them and asked to let him ask them a couple of questions before they became Dark Knights. The protagonist called out to Jessie, who was standing behind him. Turning around, Chuck asked not to answer questions, adding that she would have another job. Enraged, Jessie put her hand on her chest and asked if the protagonist wanted a good job to go to him alone. Chuck replied that they should do everything together, and if they got one job, the balance would be upset. He said that there was a suitable job for her, so she should not worry. Dissatisfied, Jessie closed her eyes and turned away. Tyrio stood over her. He looked into her eyes and said that the only and absolute ruler of this world is the Dark Lord Raven. Standing in front of her, Thurialt asked if she agreed. Looking away, Jessie replied that she did not agree. Furious, Thurialt began to shout that she did not dare to say anything against the Raven, she was not suitable for them. Upset, Jessie walked away from there. Furious, Thurialt turned his gaze to Chuck. He looked at him and asked if he agreed. Grinning, the protagonist replied that he agreed, noting that the only one who is capable of ruling this world is Raven. Thurialt stood in front of him. He smiled and said that this was well said. Standing opposite, Thurialt asked if he, as a supporter of the Raven, was ready to sacrifice himself for the dark forces, and if he, as a Dark Knight, was ready to act for the destruction of the followers of light. The protagonist stated that this was his goal. Joyful, Thurialt asked his name. Chuck, with a satisfied look, said someone else's name. Looking at him, Thurialt noticed that he had one last question. Standing over the protagonist, he asked if he was ready to sacrifice his body and soul for the Dark Lord. A sign appeared, saying that if he agreed, he would be awarded the title of Dark Knight. Smiling, Chuck said that it was his pleasure. He received many messages about being awarded the title and receiving abilities. A purple aura enveloped the protagonist's body. Looking at his hand, Chuck said that he could become stronger if he increased his shame, but if he got caught, his points would drop to 0 and he would have to develop all his skills from the beginning. Turning around, he said that these risks were what he liked about this job. Disappointed, Jessie came to the conclusion that she would have to endlessly commit crimes and run away in search of adventures. Thurialt raised his sword and cried out that he was dedicating him to the Dark Knights, and this was a small gift. Taking the sword out of its sheath, Chuck thought that it was not enough and needed to install his weapon to get something better. A message popped up that this was the Dark Knight's Thorn Sword. It is given to ordinary Dark Knights. It hurts because of its sharpness. Tyrio pointed his finger at the protagonist and ordered to spread the name of the Dark Lord across the continent. A dark portal opened. Leaving the portal, Jessie emphasized that she would go to her work. Smiling, Chuck asked her to wait. Taken aback, Jessie asked again. The protagonist took out the blade and said that friendly NPCs do not strike back, but the friendship level will drop if they are killed. Grinning, the protagonist said that their friend Tyrio belongs to the dark forces and so does he. He licked his lips and suggested that he has a lot of items and experience points. Jessie grabbed her forehead and sighed. Lowering the sword, Chuck said that he is very sorry. Swinging his blade, the protagonist said that for the sake of the bright future of the dark forces, he would have to kill him. He struck Tyrio. The protagonist imagined a fiercely fighting knight and thought about how hunting monsters gives experience and increases levels. He remembered the knight with his head down, surrounded by energy, and thought about how gold is given as a reward for completing quests, which can be used to buy items. Chuck imagined a boy carving a toy out of a potato and telling us that items can be collected. Imagining a guy smiling at a campfire and covering his hand from the fire, he said that they can be cooked. The protagonist remembered how he aimed a bow at many monsters and decided that he would create a party to search for adventures and go into a dungeon, because that is the point of MMORPG games. The guy writhed and screamed furiously. He hit Tyrio with all his might and thought that waving a weapon for 9 hours in front of an NPC who was unable to even fight back was somehow too much. This was unusual gameplay. Jessie hovered her finger over the item on the screen and thought about what her master wanted to do. She glanced at the torch and decided to follow him. Frowning, the girl ran past the guy swinging the torch and shouted that she would help him. Jessie jumped up to Thurialt and brought the torch to his face. The rival looked at the fire in his chest in surprise. Chuck looked at her with alarm and shouted that he was not afraid of fire and she was not counted among the dark forces. The girl looked at the guy in fear, raised the torch and asked what would happen if someone not initiated into dark magic struck. Jessie looked up at her rival in fear. She cowered in fear when she saw Thurialt raise his sword and shouted that the monster would fight back. The girl staggered on one leg and her head flew off. She quickly jumped back to the steps in the room. A notification appeared that she had died, and if she were reborn in the village, she would not gain experience for 3 days. Jessie's head was shocked and asked what it was and shouted to the gentleman that her head had been cut off. Chuck stood with his sword outstretched in front of Tyrio and turned around and said that if he stopped attacking, the opponent's health would be restored and that he should wait a little. He stood in front of the girl's head, continuing to inflict many blows, and said that if he were reborn in the village, he would receive a penalty and that he should not even think about it. Jessie's head was sadly crying on the ground and asking the gentleman to be faster. The plot moves us 3 hours forward. The guy was running aggressively, swinging his sword and shouting farewell words to the enemy. Swinging his sword with all his might, he cut off Tyrio's head. Chuck picked up the opponent's helmet and called Jessie to look at it. He held the helmet over his head, looking at the girl's furious head and shouting that he had avenged her. The protagonist extended his hand with the crystal and the system reported that the revival stone had been used. Jessie raised her hands and looked at her body that appeared in surprise. She was crying and holding her neck, saying that her head was cut off, she would never experience it again. Chuck turned away and grinned, clasped his hands, telling her to look at what fell out of Tyrio, she would at least worry a little about him. He entered the magic circle, where sparks appeared around the enemy's body. A notification appeared with information about the Raven mask, thanks to which anyone uninitiated in dark magic will go crazy if they put on the mask. The main character looked at the mask in his hands and said that it was a unique class, but it was only available from level 85, so he could not use it. The guy lowered his head and threw it back to the surprised girl. He stood in front of Jessie and told her to put it away and then sell it. The girl took the mask and thought about the fact that this was the cursed mask of the Dark Lord. She looked at the mask emitting energy with fear and decided that it was some kind of strange aura. The guy looked at the bottle in his hand with a smile and said that he would need it. A window with information about the item appeared and the system reported that it was a deadly Basilisk potion that created a poisonous cloud and dealt damage proportional to maximum health. The guy screamed happily. He picked up the key and looked at it in surprise and said that this had fallen out of it. The system reported that it was an unknown key of an evil aura. Interested, Jessie approached the guy and clenched her fist and asked what this key was for. Chuck extended his hand with the key to the inventory on the screen and said that later he would tell her where it could be used. The girl crossed her arms and frowned at him and said that he was playing alone. He already knew everything. The poor artificial intelligence had his head cut off here. The guy looked at her in surprise. The dissatisfied girl asked why she had even gone with him. The protagonist, smiling, pushed her into the portal and told her not to sulk because she needed to go back to the village. The guys went in and the portal began to close. Thuriel's helmet fell to the ground. The object began to create pixel interference. The monster reappeared and looked ahead. Thuriel hovered in the hall and thought that everything was exactly like this. He looked at the door in the hall and thought that the guy was right. The plot moves us to the underground city to the buildings. Joyful Jessie clasped her hands and asked if she would get a job now. Chuck went ahead down the street and, looking away, said that before that, something else needed to be done. He looked at the buildings around and told her that, as is known, the development of Wings Online began 5 years ago. Playing for a villain has more disadvantages than advantages. Chuck imagined how the guy kicked his opponent and said that it means that all the other people in the underground city are all beggars who are called psychos, even if they are not guilty of anything. He imagined a silhouette of a guy smiling evilly, crossing his arms, and telling him that the one they were going to meet was the king of all these psychopaths. The guy stood smiling in front of the scared girl and said that, to put it simply, he was the real king of psychopaths. Chuck looked at the scared smiling girl and said that they needed him to start their business and they needed a lot of things. He closed his fingers in a circle and looked through them at the surprised girl, saying that the most important thing was money. People were walking down the street in the city. A man called out to a confused guy passing by in an alley. He held out his hand, looked at the confused guy and said that by the look of him, he was being tortured by bounty hunters. He clapped his hands and said that he had the lowest prices in Korea, guaranteed a 100% safe deal, it was very cheap, he could exchange gold, so he would become even stronger. The guy walked forward and raised his hand and said that if his wife found out, he was finished. The guy in the mask stood with his fists clenched and thought about how dangerous marriage was, but it wasn't that he couldn't, he just didn't want to. The main character and the girl came up to him from behind and indignantly called him, saying that they wanted to talk to his boss. The man turned around and looked at them with concern, thinking that they were newbies, they seemed to be some kind of poor people, it was better not to react. He raised his hands up and closed his eyes, asking what they were talking about. He was just a player. Chuck looked at him and asked him to pass the information on to Sean. The man looked at him in surprise, hearing that the anchovy brought a lot of orders. He turned away and said in fear that he didn't understand what they were talking about, they were just mistaken. Jessie looked after the running guy and asked if he would let him run away. The main character calmly looked at him and said to just wait and see for himself. He sat down on the box in front of the girl and said that anchovy was a nickname he used when creating the game. He crossed his arms, looked away and said that no one gives out personal information, that was the rule, and Sean couldn't do it anyway. Chuck smiled, looking away and said that they had met before. The man ran ahead in a dark alley. The bald man watched from around the corner. Jessie looked at Chuck in fear and called him. He looked ahead in surprise. The guys were sitting in the alley surrounded by a crowd of men and the main character was saying that this fool Sean sent his freaks. The menacing man approached the guy and said that the boss wanted to see them. Alarmed, Jessie raised her fist and screamed when she saw how the gentleman was being put in a bag over his head. She looked away in surprise when she heard him tell her not to worry. The man opened the bag and said it was for safety. A crowd of people were walking through the mine. Sean's subordinates were escorting a guy and a girl with bags over their heads. The man opened the door a little and told the boss that they had them. Jesse and Chuck fell to their knees. The protagonist sat with his eyes closed while the bags were being removed from them. He opened one eye in surprise. Sean looked at the worried boys and asked if this was really the guy. He put his hand to his chin and raised an eyebrow and said that he was not the anchovy he knew. The plot moves us to a real city. The protagonist was leaving a coffee shop, looking at his phone. Chuck brought a glass to his mouth and looked at the phone screen with displeasure. He looked away in surprise and pushed the glass away when he heard his name being called. He looked at the guy in front of him, holding a coffee, and asked who he was. Sean smiled confusedly, scratching the back of his head, and said his name. The protagonist stood on the street in front of the guy and replied that he understood him. He looked at him with displeasure and asked if he knew that he could report him. Chuck stood there, holding a glass, and angrily said that he could introduce fines for stalking. Sean smiled and said that he couldn't meet him any other way. He looked at the irritated guy and begged him to drop the charges. Sean leaned over and asked to do it just this once. He stood with his head down and cried, screaming that he would never go against the rules of the game again. Chuck closed his eyes and sighed. The protagonist extended his hand and said that the matter was resolved in accordance with company policy. There was nothing he could do. Sean was shocked to hear that even if he could, he had no desire to. The guy fell to his knees and put his hands on his legs. He looked sadly at Chuck from his knees and begged him to help. The main character, while in the game, was kneeling in front of Sean and asking him to help him once, asked if these were his words. The leader of the gang raised one eyebrow and grimaced in confusion. Sean stood up and slammed his hands on the table, shouting that this was enough. He looked angrily ahead and told everyone to get out. Jessie was sitting next to the guy in fear, her hands folded on her knees. Sean closed his eyes and scratched the back of his head and sighed. The leader walked towards the guys sitting on their knees. Sean clasped his hands together and, squinting his eyes, smiled and said that Chuck seemed like some kind of loser to him, so he didn't even recognize him at first. He looked at the guy with clasped hands in admiration and asked what brought him to his humble abode. The main character sadly lowered his head and said not to overdo it. He knew that he was fired. Sean looked at him in surprise and snapped his fingers and asked what he was talking about, the unfaithful dog. Chuck stood in front of him, upset, and said that he was not anchovy, let him call him Lobo. He looked at the boss with displeasure and pointed at himself, saying that it was his nickname. Sean put his hand to his chin and thoughtfully looked up, asking if the ending Lobo was really an abbreviation for the word boss. The protagonist looked at the guy in shock. Jessie stood with her hands clasped and looked at Chuck with embarrassment, thinking about how he wanted to become the final boss in this world. The guy looked at the boss and asked to get straight to the point. He stretched out his hand and looked seriously, saying that he would share valuable information with him and he would lend him gold. Sean looked at the lamp and thought. He sat in front of the dissatisfied guy and asked if a payment system and an item that improved the leveling process would soon appear, and he offered to buy upgrade stones to sell later. Chuck calmly looked at him and replied that this was a way to make some money. He pictured a sword and spear crossed in front of a shield and said that in a month, when the 6th update comes out, the level cap will increase and new equipment will appear. He pictured people standing outside in front of the screen and said that all upgrade stones will completely disappear as soon as the currency appears. The protagonist looked sadly at the chapter and said that after the update comes out, there will be almost no upgrade stones left, but this problem will be quickly solved. Sean looked down and said that he was focused on profit, so it did not affect him as long as he could earn. He sat opposite the guy, leaning his elbows on the table, and asked if such an innovation would interfere with this game. Chuck frowned and said that this was just the beginning. He pictured Nate smiling evilly, raising his hand, and said that much worse items would be implemented. He was ready to do anything for money. The guy looked in surprise at the trade request that appeared on the screen. Sean bent over, got up from the floor, and said that it was 1 million gold coins. He had given him valuable information, so he would not take a percent. The main character stood, holding his knees and closing his eyes, thanked him and said that he would return everything soon. Sean looked at the guy standing in front of him and asked if he was going to make money on these stones. Jessie looked at the guy in confusion, hearing that he had called her. Sean stood by the table and watched the guys leave, saying that his face looked pleased. Chuck turned around and looked embarrassedly, asked what he was talking about. The guy looked at the surprised guys and said that he looked like them. Sean grinned and said that he would not be afraid to try anything to achieve his goal. He had the face of a real villain. Chuck put his hand to his chin and thought about what he said about the face of a villain. Jessie raised her hand, looked at the thoughtful guy, and said that she thought the charges were dropped. Now she was playing the friend. The protagonist walked along the street with the girl and said that this trial was just a threat. This is a kind of warning for bad players. He smiled and looked at the embarrassed girl and said that even if they had not met, the case would have been closed. Jessie looked at the buildings in the city and asked if he was tired. 15 hours had already passed. Chuck raised his hand and closed his eye and said that he was a little tired. Let him open the trading window. The girl looked at the 1 million gold on the screen and asked if that was really the entire amount. The protagonist pressed the screen and, looking at it, told the girl to first open the bank, then the inventory and buy up to the limit. Iron ore is valued at 5 gold or less. Jessie walked with her hand to her chest behind the yawning guy and asked why iron ore. Chuck went ahead, raising his hand and asked her to reach level 10 while he was gone. He turned around and, dissolving, said that she could only get a permanent job from level 10 and wished her luck. He dissolved into the textures in front of Jessie. The girl looked ahead in confusion and thought that she was on her own now. She jumped up, stretching her hand up and closing her eyes, happily thinking that she could finally really enjoy the game. Jessie opened the doors of the forge and shouted to the man that she would buy up all the iron ore for less than 5 gold. The game reported that the iron ore was successfully purchased. The girl smiled and waved her knife, cutting bats and happily repeating that she was hunting them. She smiled and jumped up, lowering the knife and cutting spiders, shouting that she was hunting them. A notification appeared that the inventory was full. She needed to free up space and try again. Jessie put her hand to her cheek, standing in front of the screen and looking away, said that she had a lot of all sorts of things. She happily said that she would make herself clothes from spider silk. The girl was sitting at the silk weaving machine and notifications appeared around her that skill levels were increasing. She clasped her hands over her mouth with delight and blushed as she looked at the many silks in her inventory, saying that it was interesting. The girl said that it was time to start cooking. Jessie was leaning over the fire with a frying pan and notifications about her cooking skill increasing appeared around her. She looked at many windows in her inventory filled with bat soup. The girl looked sadly at the screen and put her hand up and said that there was nothing else to do. Noticing the window with a fishing rod, she screamed that it was not so. Jessie smiled and raised the fishing rod above herself, catching a fish, and the system reported that her fishing skill had increased. A notification appeared that the skill had been increased to the limit. The girl smiled and closed her eyes in front of the screen with the 12th level and put her hands to her cheeks and said that she really enjoyed playing. She sat on the boxes in front of the pond holding a fishing rod and wondered why the gentleman had not yet arrived. A day had already passed. 2 guys were walking down the street towards the girl and discussing that she was a newbie. The guys were grinning as they walked towards her and discussing that she was quite advanced and was in an underground city. One of the guys licked his lips and said that he had not seen newbies for a long time. They ran forward smiling and the guy suggested that his friend beat her. The guys jumped over the thoughtful Jessie swinging at her. The guy looked at her madly and smiling, welcoming her to the underground city. The girl turned around and looked at them in fear. Meanwhile, in the real world, the sun's rays were breaking through the window. Chuck was lying on the bed wrapped in a blanket. He reached out and took the phone. The guy opened his eye and looked at the phone screen at the many messages and missed calls. The protagonist wrapped himself up and looked at his phone, thinking that it was not so easy to get into the underground city. He needed to come up with an excuse. The plot moves us to the street to a cafe. Chuck was turning food in a frying pan. An alarmed Chloe looked at him and asked if he was really going on a trip. The protagonist calmly looked at her and stretched out his hand, saying that he had worked like a horse for 15 years. He needed to go somewhere very far away. Ron, smiling, held his wands and said that it was a great idea. Chuck was sitting at a table in a cafe with the guys and thinking about the fact that, starting from school, they had been developing wings online together. The protagonist looked warily to the side and thought that Labo's unusual style of play would be a problem, since he would only fall under suspicion. He decided that traveling was the best alibi. Chloe sat with her arms crossed opposite the guys and asked where he was going. The protagonist sat next to the chewing guy and said that he always wanted to visit India or South America, and also Bali. Chuck looked at the girl thoughtfully. He looked at the disgruntled Chloe, who crossed her arms and thought that she clearly did not believe him. She had a good sense. Ron held food in his hands and with his mouth full told the guy that he should have a good rest, otherwise he worked like a horse. Chloe put the glass on the table and asked where he was going to go next. Chuck looked at her in confusion. She looked at the guy tensely, raising the glass and asking what he was going to do next. The protagonist sat at the table in a panic and, looking up, answered that he did not know and had not thought about it yet. Ron was putting food on a sheet of paper with chopsticks and saying that he wanted to rest too. The girl said that she couldn't remember the last time she slept normally. Chuck smiled, closed his eyes and brought a glass to his mouth and said that they could quit too. The guys were sitting at the table with their heads down and Chloe asked if it was worth it. The protagonist looked at her in surprise. The girl drank the drink and, closing her eyes, said that it was so sudden. She abruptly put the glass on the table. Chloe looked down, holding the container and said that maybe it was really time to end this. She had wanted to for a long time. The girl was sitting at the table opposite the guys and, with her head down, asked why they didn't start over. The guys looked at her in surprise. She smiled sweetly and said that she was simply suggesting that they create a small company, like they dreamed of in high school. Why don't the 3 of them start developing a game? Ron clenched his fists and joyfully shouted that he agreed. If Chuck helped, then he was for it. The main character sat silently at the table with his head down. He closed his eyes and smiled and asked if they had already managed to get drunk. Chuck frowned, looking at the indignant girl, and asked what about her sick mother and her brother's education. Chloe looked at him upset. The guy turned angrily to his worried friend and asked if he wanted to leave his pregnant wife. How did they even come up with such nonsense? Chuck closed his eyes and poured a drink, pushing the guy with his shoulder, telling them to forget about it. He poured alcohol into a shot glass and told them to drink more. The guys were sitting at a table in a cafe, and Chuck was thinking about how one day they would create their own company and work on games together. He sat sadly among the guys, deciding that this was impossible now. The guy raised the glass to his lips and thought that at the moment, he should take revenge on the company for ruining the game. The guy closed his eyes, drank alcohol, and decided that he needed to become a real villain. Chuck imagined the cafe and thought that he wondered how Jesse was doing. The girl parried the blows of the furious guy with a knife. The opponent looked forward in surprise. The bald man swung his fist and screamed loudly. He struck the ground in front of the girl with all his might. The man looked at her in shock. Jessie stood holding the blade and stretching out her hand. She closed her eyes in embarrassment and smiled and asked what was the matter, why they suddenly stopped. The guy looked at her in surprise, raising an eyebrow and asking who it was. He looked at his friend and asked how the noob managed to block such an attack. The guy frowned and shouted that there must have been some mistake. They would try again. The man looked forward angrily and agreed with him. The guys quickly ran towards the girl. Jessie looked at them in surprise. She put her hands out in front of her and holding the blade looked at the opponents. The guy jumped up and swung his knife with a smile. He was surprised and gritted his teeth when he saw that she had blocked the attack. The game reported that the blow was blocked. The man reached out to her and swung his fist. He tried to strike with all his might, grinning. The system reported again that the blow was blocked. An unhappy Jesse stood in front of the guys holding a blade and asking them why they weren't calming down. The guy looked at his friend in confusion and said that it didn't look like a bug. He looked away in shock and shouted that he didn't understand anything, because even if blocking a blow reduced damage, she should have suffered at least a little. The man frowned at the girl and replied that with such a weapon it was quite possible. He looked at Jesse and said that the only weapon with a 100% damage reduction and wings online can be bought at the village shop for beginners. The man remembered how the girl stood holding a blade and stretching out her hand in front of the guys and said that it was a beginner's dagger. The guy looked at him in surprise, raised an eyebrow, and asked if that was fair. He looked away indignantly and asked if he meant to say that she blocked the attack solely with skills. The man looked forward seriously and said that it was one of the two. He looked at the indignant girl with the dagger and said that she was either a PvP genius or a cheater. The guy stood next to his friend and said that he had not yet met cheaters in this game. He reached for the weapon on his back and said that they would check for themselves. The guy pulled the arrow and the crossbow with all his strength and said that now they would find out if she was a cheater or not. He smiled, raised the weapon and shouted at her that she should try to block it. The guy stood, raised the crossbow and released many electric projectiles, using a rain of arrows. A bunch of sharp arrows flew straight at the girl. Jessie desperately looked at the falling arrows. She ran in a circle, raised her dagger and blocked all the arrows. The guys looked at her in shock and discussed that she was a cheater. The girl looked away in alarm. She stood in fear under the rain of arrows, raising her weapon. The tip of the arrow pierced the dagger through and through. The system reported that the dagger broke due to low durability. Jessie stood, raising the handle and looking in surprise at the falling fragments of the dagger. She looked at the small piece remaining in her hand in confusion. The girl looked up in alarm. Many arrows were flying at her, striking. A notification appeared that the girl had died. We see a waterfall in the middle of an underground city. The man stood next to his friend in front of the girl's corpse and asked if she had used cheats or if she was just a noob with good reflexes. He looked warily at the dead Jessie and said that it was somehow scary and that the developers should be informed. Chuck asked why the two of them attacked one girl. The guys turned around in surprise. The protagonist stood with his hand to his head and his eyes closed, saying that he would soon explode if he got drunk again. You could safely call him a dirty dog. The guy looked at Chuck in surprise and asked who the hell he was. Chuck stood behind the guys and looked at the dead Jessie, saying that he was a friend of this child. The girl lay with an arrow in her forehead and cried, calling for her master. He took out his sword and said that if they were eager to kill, they should be ready to die themselves. The protagonist raised his sword and frowned, asking if they knew about this rule. Chuck drew his blade and said that when killing a player, you need to count on the fact that there is a chance of being destroyed yourself. He put the sword in front of his head and asked his opponent if he knew these rules. Charlie and Bob stood in bewilderment, looking at the guy. Suddenly, the protagonist jumped up and ran towards them, swinging his sword. He delivered a dashing blow, which shook the guy with the crossbow. The attacker cut the opponent's right sleeve without causing him any pain. The guy looked at his hand in amazement and said in bewilderment that he didn't know who Chuck was. According to him, he used to think that he was at least someone, but apparently he was just an upstart. Charlie turned towards his opponent and shouted that he was a worthless brat. Chuck turned around in confusion and realized that he couldn't do any damage since he and his opponent were on different levels. Bob jumped from the ceiling and loudly repeated the phrase that the guy said when he drew his sword. The protagonist was not ready to accept this unexpected attack and looked up in shock. The man loudly asked him if he was ready to die himself since he allowed himself to say such things. He dealt a strong blow, because of which the guy in huge stone blocks flew to the sides. After doing a few somersaults to the side, Chuck stopped and got to his feet. He took a deadly potion from his bosom and thought that, of course, he would be sorry to part with it. The protagonist, without thinking twice, realized that there was no other way out in this situation, after which he threw the potions towards the opponents. A large green cloud of smoke formed in the place where the green bottle landed. The opponents, having smelled and seen the breath of the deadly potion in the air, realized that they needed to act quickly. Charlie shouted to the others to immediately get out of the poisonous cloud, and he himself hurried to the exit. His comrades hurried to hide from the area of the toxins as quickly as possible. Chuck took out another potion and threw it right in their path. The guys stopped in shock, seeing an explosion in front of them. Charlie asked them to split up and retreat in scattered order so that they could not be hit at the same time. The protagonist appeared above their heads, holding a large torch in his hand. He asked them not to worry because, according to him, this fog is just gas. He threw the torch to the ground towards his opponents and declared that if he set it on fire, it would disappear immediately. Charlie turned around and ran, asking them to beware of such destructive force. Bob was also confused and did not know how to behave. Chuck watched from above as the flames flared up and the gas detonated. The shockwave was destructive and even threw Jessie back, who, having turned over in the air several times, called out to her master. The huge building was filled with flames and smoke. Bob drank the red potion and turned towards his comrade, ordering him to follow his example. Charlie was shaking from head to toe and claimed that he was stunned by such an explosion. The guy thought that he had lost more than 70% of his health and fell into a state of stun. He understood that if he was attacked before the recovery was complete, he was finished. Chuck was leaving the burning building, passing between the flames. When the opponents noticed him, they were shocked. The guy said that his opinion had changed, and high-level players were no longer a joke. The protagonist had a brutal look, and he said that he was surprised by the survivability of his opponents. Charlie shouted at his comrade to stall for time until he recovered and could not move. Bob stood in front of him, interceding and saying that he could not worry about it now. The man's iron limbs collapsed, demonstrating his resilience and intentions to protect his friend and accomplice. Green flames flared around him, which marked the adoption of a defensive position. This skill allows you to take attacks on yourself instead of an immobilized party member, therefore increasing the strength of defense. Chuck was amazed by the ingenuity and strength of his opponent, so he decided to act ahead. He swung the sword behind his back again and summoned a dark aura. The guy grabbed the weapon with both hands and ran towards the man, declaring that his techniques would not work on him. Bob tried to stay calm and was confident in his defense. When the protagonist got closer, he attacked. His opponent did not expect such a strong attack, so for a moment he could not move or say words from pain. The man did not understand how it was possible to inflict so much damage in one blow. Chuck replied that this attack was very different from the previous blow because this time he used the Dark Knight skill. The Dark Aura skill is capable of inflicting twice as much damage and penetrating stronger armor. The protagonist understood that using a percentage of his health per second was a rather risky move, but given the difference in their levels, this remains the only way. After these thoughts, the guy delivered a few more control blows to Bob, thinking about finishing him off as quickly as possible. Charlie stood behind the man. He demanded to remove the defensive position and attack the opponent. Without thinking twice, his comrade agreed to these measures and separated his hands, canceling the skill. The opponent immediately jumped up and swung for a blow, declaring that at this point the guy's fun would end. Chuck looked at his attack and grinned discontentedly. The man delivered an iron blow to his opponent, from which a strong impulse is created. The guy was thrown along the ground for several meters while he tried to resist the force. Bob smiled contentedly and looked at the dissipating smoke at the place of the blow. Suddenly, his expression changed dramatically to surprise and shock. Chuck stood at the place of the attack unharmed, holding the red-hot dagger of the newcomer in his hand. The opponents were confused and furious seeing this. Chuck wondered how the guy was able to pull off such a substitution. Bob turned around and objected, saying that it was usually impossible to change weapons during a battle. His comrade insisted and was sure that it was theoretically possible, although he himself had never seen anything like it. The opponents knew that even a few seconds lost during a weapon change could result in punishment. There was a chance that it would be dropped on the ground. Many could forget about the existence of such a move, because even a few seconds like that in a battle could decide its outcome. Bob looked at his opponent again in surprise, not understanding who he was and how he could use this move so dexterously. Charlie called out to the man and said that they had better get out of here as quickly as possible. The opponents instantly disappeared around the corner, shouting that they had most likely run into not an ordinary newbie, but a high ranker. Chuck smugly pulled his sword out in front of him again and said that he did not like calling himself a ranker. He swung, creating a purple aura around his weapon, and shouted loudly that he considered himself a living fossil. Charlie and Bob heard these words, after which they turned around with shocked looks and looked at him again. The protagonist ran at great speed, holding his sword forward and wanting to defeat his opponents. The man decided not to give up and again prepared for battle, shouting for him to attack him. Chuck rushed past him at great speed, not spending a second to destroy him. Bob turned around in fear and assumed that he was not aiming at him. Charlie looked at his comrade and shouted at him not to worry, because, according to him, the stunning was almost finished. The guy did not expect Chuck to catch up with him so quickly. The enemy did not even have time to finish speaking, as the protagonist cut him into 2 parts. After that, the hero turned around and struck again, from which the guy darted from side to side. The defeated opponent suggested that perhaps he should take a break from the game for now. At the end of the building, he heard loud laughter and a man's gasp behind the door. His emotions were pouring out and could be heard from everywhere. Bob closed the door behind him and stood behind it to prevent Chuck from opening it. He was trying to catch his breath and figure out where this guy had come from and who he was. The man decided that he had better log out of the game, so he called up a blue dialog box and pressed the button. He read the message that he would be logged out of his account in 5 seconds. Bob, in fear and anticipation, began to count down the seconds, sitting by the door and hoping that he would not be found in that time. Each second was very difficult for him, but he was glad that there were only 4 left. Suddenly, the man heard someone's voice from above, saying the number 3 for him. He looked in amazement in the direction from which the voice came and repeated after it. Chuck jumped off the roof of the building and swung his weapon, saying that he only had 2 seconds left. Bob screamed loudly that he had 1 second left and, hoping for his salvation, continued to sit still. The protagonist cut his body into 2 parts using strong magic for his blade. The man's scream was heard from everywhere, and a large cloud of dust formed in his place. Jesse was floating with an arrow in his head, half submerged in water. He repeated the phrase that he hoped that his master did not forget him. Chuck used the stone in resurrection, after which he received a corresponding notification about it. The guy spread his arms to the sides, after which a hologram of the player appeared in front of him. After a few moments, Jesse's texture began to appear. He was shaking with fear and crying, declaring that this was too risky work for him and he could not do this anymore. Chuck patted him on the head and apologized for that situation. The protagonist noticed that he was late in resurrecting his comrade and asked his interlocutor about it. Jesse looked at his hand again and was overjoyed to realize that his master had patted him on the head and praised him. He closed his eyes and decided to accept the apology. The comrade noted that he was used to it because he had been resurrected so many times because of his plans. Suddenly, a notification about a new player appeared behind the interlocutors. Chuck, surprised, began to scroll through the text and read, assuming that in fact those 2 were just small fish and pawns. Jesse, shocked, asked him again because, according to him, those guys were strong enough and he did not think that there was someone even more powerful behind them. The protagonist explained that if in a battle of dark side users one kills another, then half of the opponent's shame points goes to the winner. He also reminded that he only got 2,000 points from that victory. After these words, the guy looked at the dialogue box again and read that his level had been increased by only 1. Chuck said wearily that he was still very far from a high level. The protagonist closed the blue window and turned to Jesse. He asked the interlocutor to make small delays when using combat techniques because his reaction speed could be mistaken for a nuclear weapon. The guy sheepishly asked again whether he should artificially create delays on purpose. Chuck turned around again and confirmed his words, asking to show a little humanity and listen to him. The interlocutor, hearing about humanity, was touched and thoughtful. The girl's thoughts were interrupted by the protagonist, who had already climbed the stairs and asked why she did not follow him. Jessie looked up enthusiastically and hurried after her master. Chuck was thinking about his plans to get her a new class. The interlocutor could not believe what she heard and was very happy. Finally, they came to the gate from which a white light was coming. The girl called out to the guy and asked if this building was a temple. The protagonist quickly responded to these words, putting his hands on her shoulders. He addressed the interlocutor by name. Chuck explained that in order to use the Dark Knight's skills, you will have to spend a certain amount of health. According to him, it is better to constantly monitor its indicators so as not to end up at 0. The protagonist gave the example of a potion that should restore health. He shook the interlocutor and said that healing was also part of these duties. The guy took a short pause, after which he loudly shouted that she should become a priestess. After another short pause, Chuck said that she should also replenish his blood. Jessie was perplexed by the words she heard. The interlocutor said that the owner was simply going to make her a mobile personal healer. The protagonist did not want the girl to think in this direction further, so he quickly reacted and decided to distract her. The guy deftly picked up the interlocutor and threw her over his shoulder, declaring that they still had a lot to do and they should quickly follow the new class. Jessie tried to resist and insisted that she also wanted to become the owner of a hidden class. She continued to scream and said that she was promised this. After some time, they began to go back, and Chuck noticed that the girl had fallen behind him. The guy turned around in surprise, trying to find out why she stopped. Jessie was standing modestly with a healer's staff and new clothes, saying that everything was over for her. A blue window notified that she was now a priestess. The protagonist came up and patted the girl on the head again, praising her appearance and noting that it suited her very well. According to him, being a priestess is her calling. Chuck spread his arms and said that priestesses are very valuable, and it is worth barely hinting about a raid as a whole line forms behind them. Jessie did not want to continue this conversation and asked to go quickly. The protagonist went towards the exit and said that it was time for them to go to the next target since Jessie had a class. The interlocutor said menacingly that she did not support the killing of NPCs and hoped that he would not do it anymore. Chuck turned around and said that their mission was to reach level 90, the highest point, in 1 month. The girl was amazed that the deadline was so tight. Jessie knew that usually it took 6 months or more to achieve this. The protagonist said that in a month the most significant update in history would begin, as well as a new continent would open and the latest equipment models would appear. Chuck also mentioned at the end that the highest level would now be considered the 100th. The guy was sure that they had to reach it before the update ended. The protagonist wanted to become a monopolist on the new continent thanks to this. They approached the underground snake lair. Jessie looked warily into the depths of the cave and called out to the owner. The priestess assumed that the level 50 dungeon would be difficult for their skills and impossible for their level. The guy looked back and insistently asked her not to panic, because he had everything thought out. Suddenly, their dialogue was interrupted by the noise of stones and a sound from the cave. When Chuck turned around and looked ahead again, he saw a giant head of a gray snake in front of him. He quickly reacted and pushed Jessie aside so that she would not be hurt by the beast's attack. Stones scattered to the sides from the place where the monster struck. The girl fell a few steps to the ground, letting go of the weapon. She clenched her teeth and looked towards the monster, saying that it hurt. The priestess saw her master standing surrounded by stone pillars and how a voice was heard from inside the cave and the silhouette of the beast was visible. The snake caught Chuck by surprise because he was not ready for something like this. He grabbed his sword and looked menacingly towards his opponent. The protagonist summoned a dark aura, which again enveloped his weapon. The guy asked his partner to heal him while he attacked, losing health. Chuck rushed to attack with great speed, and the girl grabbed her weapon again, accepting his instructions. Jessie promised herself that she would definitely protect her master. The protagonist jumped into the air and swung to strike. The blow cut through the snake's flesh, and blood flowed out. When Chuck landed on the ground, he looked towards the monster while it wriggled in pain and screamed loudly. The enemy touched him with his tail while waving it from side to side. The guy felt great pain from such a blow and flew to the side. Jessie, seeing how her master flew into the wall with great speed, was very worried about him. She immediately activated her newly acquired healing touch skill. Green crosses appeared around Chuck, which corresponded to the fact that the healing had begun. A few moments later, the guy praised the girl because he saw how the blood was draining from his face and he himself was starting to feel better. The protagonist asked his partner if he could trust her and move on to his goal. The girl asked him to rely on her and the guy moved to attack again. Jessie once again used the healing touch skill and stretched her hand up to the green circle. Thanks to her healing, Chuck could continue the battle further, not noticing the loss of health from his own blows. The guy furiously struck the hood of a large snake. Jessie stood to the side and constantly used the healing touch to prevent the loss of health of her master. The protagonist turned in her direction in confusion and did not understand what was going on. Chuck loudly shouted at her not to use the spell so often, because the monster could notice her. According to him, she had already healed him, so there was no need to waste the skill so much. The guy didn't have time to say his recommendations on using healing as he saw the snake heading towards the girl. The protagonist understood that it was too late to talk about it and Jessie was in serious danger. The girl was in shock and stupor when she saw a huge monster approaching her. The head of the huge snake opened its mouth and was approaching at a stunning pace. Chuck turned around and saw the monster catching up with his partner. He called out loudly to her in the hope that Jessie would make the right decision and save herself. A moment later, the guy took the sword with both hands and thought. He kept in mind that he could spend a maximum of 1% of his health per second. The protagonist gritted his teeth and realized that without healing he would be able to hold out for a little more than 1 minute. Chuck looked at the beast, which was already approaching him. He realized that he would not escape the penalty of points if he died. The boy re-entered the battle and quickly ran towards his opponent, thinking that he couldn't let this happen. He jumped into the air and swung his weapon towards the snake. The protagonist was confused and didn't understand why the monster had gone around him and quickly rushed behind him. He clenched his teeth in anger and turned around, thinking that he should pull himself together. Chuck, seeing the tail approaching, realized that this was an attack style that he had invented himself. It was quite difficult to dodge it, because this attack was delivered with the tail. The boy was able to avoid a strong attack, but still flew to the side due to the shock wave. When he landed on the ground, he saw the snake wrap itself around his body. Chuck couldn't afford his mistake, so he quickly jumped up and found himself out of the opponent's attack. The protagonist remembered his attack and realized that another one would follow. The snake opened its mouth, revealing its poisonous fang. The guy understood that it was going to pierce him with its poisonous fang for the last time. At the moment of the monster's attack, Chuck jumped into the air and saw the body of the snake quickly rushing under him. He understood that in this situation there was only one chance to defeat it with one blow. The protagonist furiously grabbed the sword with both hands and pointed it down in order to pierce the opponent's flesh. He was going to throw all his energy into this blow. Having descended lower, he nevertheless pierced the snake's head and threw all his energy into this attack. To achieve this effect, the guy moved his weapon to the hilt. From the pain experienced, the monster opened its mouth and roared loudly. Chuck understood that he could not cope alone and he needed help. He tried to stay on the snake's head while it twitched furiously and tried to throw him off. Eventually, the monster threw the guy off its head and roared loudly in pain again. The protagonist fell to the ground, realizing that if he hit her one more time, he could win. He thought that his mission had failed and he was about to die and lose health. Suddenly, the guy noticed how his hand was covered in green crosses. He was very surprised and was at a loss as to how this was possible. Chuck landed on the ground and looked at his body in surprise. Healing textures were flying around him in the air. The protagonist immediately thought of Jessie and assumed that she was still alive. The guy looked at the glowing, swollen body of the snake. After seeing this, he rushed to attack, shouting at the girl to wait until he pulled her out. The two opponents came face to face again and moved towards each other. Chuck swung his sword and dealt a powerful blow that cut the snake's body in two. When the monster died, the guy noticed that the snake had a thickening behind it. He came closer and ripped the snake's skin, seeing Jessie there. The partner squinted one eye and looked towards her savior. The protagonist loudly cried out her name and was glad that she was alive. The girl quietly called out to him and looked into his eyes. She put her glowing hand forward and said that she could be relied on, as she said. After some time, the guys were already getting out of the cave, and a voice of great surprise was heard, Jessie. Kak looked at the blue dialogue box and noted that thanks to the murder of one snake, they rose 5 levels. Chuck said that this happened because the difference in levels was quite significant. The protagonist also remembered something and looked towards the glowing sphere. He said that the reward for defeating the snake was just junk, although he didn't come here for it. He looked at the dropped items and thought about it, saying that next time they would need to go to a dungeon where they give out normal rewards. Jessie looked at the owner, who had spread and raised his hands up by the wall. She asked him in confusion what he was doing. Chuck said that initially there should have been a lizardman's dungeon here. The protagonist continued to walk along the stone wall and feel it. He noted that perhaps this change was made because of the game. The guy told his interlocutor that some users don't like monsters that look like people. Chuck, continuing to examine the wall, said that in the understanding of many, monsters should look like monsters and people like people. The girl listened carefully to his assumption and said that now she understood the principle by which the game was developed. The guy continued to talk and said that the lizard people used to be a race that often used traps. He was sure that somewhere here there were clearly traces of their creations. Having stumbled upon another stone, the protagonist grabbed it, after which a rumble was heard from the side. When the guys looked in front of them, they saw a giant crevice that had just appeared. Jessie was surprised and shocked by what she saw. She looked down and said that one only has to fall here, as the user will immediately face inevitable death. Chuck added that most of the monsters in this dungeon die after the first hit. The guy was still holding onto the stone and said that it was time for the girl to go. Jessie did not understand what was required of her and what the owner was hiding from her. The protagonist drew her attention to the crevice and said that it was time for her to lure the monsters. The interlocutor was shocked that she would have to do it. Chuck exhaled nervously and asked if she wanted him to do it for her. He said that in that case, all she had to do was bring back 10 killed monsters. Jessie, hearing about such a task, nervously swallowed and looked at the guy. A few moments later, she was walking through the cave, dragging her staff behind her. Suddenly, she noticed movement from the side and looked there, seeing a giant snake. The girl nervously looked back at Chuck and tried to ask him for help, to which he continued to look at her in surprise. The protagonist made a happy smile and raised both hands up, saying that she only had to kill 10 of them. Jessie was amazed that this task was so difficult and dangerous. She ran away, screaming loudly and waving her staff. The snake hissed loudly behind her and tried to catch up with its prey. Several more snakes descended from several sides to the girl's screams. Chuck watched from the side as clouds of dust and dirt rose in the distance. For a moment, everything was quiet. The protagonist continued to look into the distance, hoping for further developments. Suddenly, sounds and dust resumed at the end of the cave. Jessie, running away from the angry snakes, screamed loudly and asked the owner to save her. The guy clenched his hand into a fist and screamed loudly that she had very little time left. The partner closed her eyes and said that she was tired of dying. When the girl approached Chuck, he screamed that he was acting. After these words, the guy turned the stone back. Jessie jumped into the passage, putting her hand and staff forward. The monsters followed her and tried to kill her until the last moment. When the passage began to shrink, the snakes experienced severe pain and blood flow. The girl in the air stretched out her hand to the owner so that he could catch her. Chuck stretched out his hand in response. Jessie was about to grab it and save herself. At the last moment, the protagonist missed and their hands did not meet, making it impossible to catch the girl. They were both very scared and looked at each other. Before she fell, Jessie said with displeasure that this should not be. Chuck continued to watch her fall with an outstretched hand in surprise. He sat down on the edge of the crevice and heard his partner fall to the bottom. 2 hours later, the girl was still running from the monsters, luring them after her. Running up to the designated point, she shouted to the guy that these were the last 8 monsters that were running after her. Chuck accepted her report and turned the stone so that the snakes fell into the pit. A second later, a huge crevice appeared behind Jessie again. All the monsters that were chasing the priestess began to fall and roar loudly. The girl was able to jump in time and land right on the edge of the platform. She boasted that it took her only 3 deaths to fully understand the principle of such a hunt. Jessie approached Chuck and bragged that she was now level 32. The protagonist praised her and said that it was a great job. He turned around and walked away, noting that it seemed like it was time to change classes. The priestess happily supported his proposal. The guy thought about it and said that now was not the time for that. This time he suggested dealing with the boss as well, because, according to him, he felt sorry to lose an entire monster. Their path lay deep into the cave. When the guys went through it all, they saw a huge iron door at the end of the path. Jessie said that a level 50 boss, despite the fact that her own level had also increased, would be too difficult. The guy asked her not to panic ahead of time and said that this time they would use traps. The girl irritably asked if she would be bait in his plan again. Without thinking twice, Chuck turned around and walked away, saying that it would be enough for Jessie to simply open the door and go a little inside. The girl listened in confusion as he was about to activate the trap right there. She nervously rolled her eyes and asked herself why she was so worried. The priestess opened the doors and timidly walked inside. She held her staff in her right hand and moved deeper with small steps. Jessie was very scared and could not see anything in the cave, which she told Chuck. At the very end of the cave were inactive torches, illuminated by a weak light leaking from the open door. The girl noticed that in an instant, fire flared up in them. The torches began to fill with flames one by one, creating a fiery path as they approached the pedestal at the end of the cave. The priestess stopped in place and watched in confusion as a strange black silhouette appeared at the end of the path. The girl looked closer and saw the outline of a huge snake. She was very shocked and could hardly pronounce the name of the Basilisk. Chuck smiled and looked out from behind the door and reminded her that she might turn to stone for a while, but he said that was normal. Jessie, very scared, turned around and tried to find out more details, not understanding what he was talking about. At the end of the cave, the gray silhouette's eyes began to fill with red light. The basilisk woke up and looked at its victim. It roared loudly, surrounded by lit torches. The girl was shocked and looked at her legs, which she could barely move. She tried to ask her owner for help, noticing that her hands were also starting to turn to stone. Chuck told her not to worry because he was going to lure the monster into a trap before it attacked the girl. Jessie was still very scared and looked at the loudly roaring snake. After some time, the basilisk headed towards her at high speed. The priestess screamed loudly in fear and did not know what to do because she herself could not move. The protagonist looked out from behind the door again and looked in her direction with disappointment. He reached out with his hand to press the stone button. The huge snake stopped in the middle of its path when it saw stone spears flying from the sky. The basilisk did not expect such an attack. One of the petrified projectiles hit the snake right in the skull. A moment later, the monster roared fiercely and looked at the girl. He fell right in front of her feet because his body was pierced many times. Jessie looked into the eyes of the snake and grinned hysterically. The girl noticed how Chuck was already standing behind her and insisting that he was right and there was nothing special about it. The priestess noticed one of the stone blocks, which moved for a moment. She looked at her in surprise, expecting something. The girl's body was instantly cut into 2 parts. The protagonist, seeing the sight, was shocked and amazed. He examined the fossils left behind by Jessie and her staff. A blue dialogue box appeared in front of the guy, where he read that he had cleared the dungeon. The remaining half of the priestess's head said that now she understood why artificial intelligence in films constantly revolts. After some time, when the guys had already gotten out of the dungeon, Chuck was discussing the efficiency of the physical engine. JC looked at him with displeasure. The protagonist looked at the offended girl and suggested that she go change classes. The priestess said that perhaps this was so and turned away. The guy, looking at her habits and behavior, realized that she was offended. Chuck scratched the back of his head and decided that the best decision now would be to head to the temple. At that moment, the girl was furious and her eyes seemed to glow red. The protagonist looked at the upset and offended girl and asked her to come there later. He understood her feelings, so he asked for forgiveness in his thoughts. A purple sphere of energy appeared behind the guys. The guy told the interlocutor that he did not have time to console her. He said that something would appear very soon. Chuck turned towards the sphere, where the silhouette of the knight was already visible. Tyrio appeared in that place, who, spreading his arms to the sides, greeted him. He congratulated the guy on having already reached level 30. The interlocutor praised him for improving at an unimaginable speed and noted that this made the gentleman very happy. The protagonist thought about the friendliness indicators, which were still normal. He put his finger to his chin and thought that he should destroy him again. Thurialt interrupted his thoughts and said that he wanted to awaken his potential. He asked him if he wanted to become a Dark Knight. Chuck said with irritation in his voice that this desire was obvious. A red circular pattern appeared around his feet, which lifted the guy into the air. In the blue dialogue box, he saw that from that moment on, he became a Dark Knight. The guy received the skill of continuous attack and a dark hand. The protagonist hung in the air with his arms outstretched and surprise in his eyes. Streams of wind lowered the guy to the ground after all the notifications. Chuck could not get out of his head that he was now the owner of the skill of continuous attack and a dark hand. He decided that from that moment on he could consider himself a real Dark Knight. Suddenly, the guy thought about it and decided that it was time for him to try out his new skills. Thurialt looked at him in amazement, not understanding what he wanted from him. The protagonist heard a voice that was trying to shout to him. He recognized the voice, but couldn't do anything because the surroundings began to fade. The owner of that voice asked him to come to him if he heard those words. A notification appeared before Chuck's eyes that the goddess was calling him. The message itself asked whether he should accept her challenge. The protagonist, thinking, decided that if he fulfilled all the conditions for changing his class, he would be able to meet the goddess. He, surrounded by blue pixels, said that he would be happy to come to her, after which he said goodbye to Tyrio. A stream of blue energy transferred him to another place and opened a portal there. Chuck appeared through a hologram in an unfamiliar territory. The guy got up from the ground and looked into the distance. In front of him, he saw the goddess. The girl approached the hunter and greeted him in her blood. The protagonist looked at her with anger. The interlocutor corrected her words and thought about it. She called him master and smiled. Chuck was angry because, according to him, she first crushed him like a bug and now calls him master. The girl said that in fact she did not want to crush him, but just accidentally landed on his head. The protagonist was still not going to let that incident go. He said that it was all a lie and addressed her by name. The guy looked menacingly into her eyes and said that he wanted to ask one question. He was interested in why this happened. Gaia, hearing his words, was disappointed and frowned. The game characters in helmets ran from the fire. They fell to the ground, devoured by the black virus. The entire city was blazing when someone said that it was a pity, but nothing could be done about it. Gaia was standing next to the protagonist when he ordered her to erase all the information. The blonde opened her mouth, looking ahead when she answered that she obeyed her master. The system windows of the game control appeared in front of her. A system notification appeared, stating that the data analysis process was 85% complete. Then a system notification appeared, stating that the data analysis was complete. Then a system window appeared, asking if they really wanted to delete the data. Gaia stood silently, her hands in front of her. The blonde looked down sadly when the protagonist said that he had one question for her, and then asked why she had not deleted the data about the epidemic. They stood surrounded by columns when she answered that the owner was no longer the manager, so she could not answer the question asked. Chuck opened his mouth when he said that Gaia told Nate about the disease and used this fact to frame him, and then asked if this was all her doing. The blonde looked emotionlessly ahead when she apologized, adding that she could not answer this question. The protagonist silently looked forward. He closed his eyes as he exhaled and said that she was just a machine that looked like a human. Gaia looked ahead sadly as Chuck asked what he expected from an artificial intelligence. The protagonist held up his index finger as he asked her to wait until he put an end to her in this world. The blonde pursed her lips and told the owner that he had not changed at all. The stars shone in the night sky as she added that although he thought rationally, He sometimes acted inconsequentially. Gaia looked ahead determinedly as she said that she liked this trait in him, but she would do anything to save the others. They stood opposite each other. Chuck looked ahead intently. He stood in front of a long-haired blonde who said that she would look forward to the moment when he returned to turn this world into dust. The protagonist clenched his fist and said that he would not disappoint her. Gaia folded her arms in front of him as Chuck said that as a result, Wings Online was doomed to a tragic ending. The blonde opened her mouth slightly, looking forward. She folded 2 fingers. Gaia smiled kindly as she asked the Deer Demon King that their battle would be exciting. The blonde snapped her fingers. The protagonist looked down in surprise. A bracelet appeared on his wrist as he asked what it was. Gaia closed her eyes and replied that it was some kind of privilege, adding that it was given to all hunters who decided to challenge the gods. Chuck stood in front of her as she said that it was a very useful thing. The protagonist looked at his hand and said that he was really just some hunter. He looked ominously from under his brows as he asked if Gaia was being too arrogant. The blonde smiled sweetly and replied that she would count the minutes until they met again, when the master's blade would touch her neck. Gaia stood in front of him when he began to disappear and said that she wished him a pleasant pastime. Chuck looked ahead with disdain. A bright flash appeared where they were standing. The protagonist was lying with his arms spread out to the sides. A bracelet flashed on his wrist when a system window appeared, which said that the ban was lifted after reaching level 70. Chuck, lying down, raised his hand up when he thought about what it was. Gaia hugged Jessie, who addressed her. The blonde smiled, blushing when she said that they had not seen each other for a long time. The girl buried her face in her hand when she said that after the master was fired, she could not connect to napalm. Gaia looked warmly at Jessie, who said that she missed her very much. They were standing surrounded by columns when she asked the blonde about how she knew the master's plans. Gaia had her back turned when she answered in the affirmative. Tears appeared in Jessie's eyes. The blonde looked at the girl seriously and asked her to take care of him, because even though he pretended to be a strong person, he was actually kind and weak. Jessie looked forward, crying, when she agreed. Gaia stretched her arms forward when she answered that she envied her. The blonde hugged the girl, explaining that she could play with the master. They were standing in the center of the ruins when Gaia added that she always wanted to go on a journey through this world with him, and then asked what it was like to play with him. Jessie remembered how her head was cut off. Then she imagined a huge snake. The girl remembered raising her hand when she was asked about how it was probably fun. Jessie imagined how half of her head was cut off. The girl looked away and answered that it really was fun. They were standing close to each other when Gaia asked her to enjoy it for her too. Jessie looked kindly at the blonde and exclaimed that she would try. The girl loomed over Gaia when she said goodbye to her and said that this was just the beginning. Jessie exclaimed with tears in her eyes that they would definitely see each other again. Gaia stood under the starry sky when she thought about how they would see each other again anyway. The blonde looked down sadly when she added that there would be no bad ending. The guy was sitting on the steps. In front of the main character was a system window. Jessie looked out from behind the corner. She remembered Gaia hugging her and telling her that she envied her because she could play with her master. The girl stood there with her eyes closed. She opened her mouth and exhaled. Jessie ran towards the protagonist, calling him master. Chuck waved his hand and asked her if she was no longer offended and if she had changed her class yet. The girl stopped in front of him and smiled when she exclaimed that, as he said, she had become a true healer. The protagonist stood in front of her and said that it was great. They raised their hands up cheerfully when he asked if it was time to level up, to which the girl answered yes. The snake statue had its mouth open on the second day in the lair of the poisonous snake. Behind the creature, the columns were visible during the 30th attempt of the Basilisk attack. The snake opened its red eyes. Jessie looked towards the red glow as she thought that she finally figured out how to avoid petrification. The girl held the staff in front of her as she asked the master to get ready because he would be coming soon. The protagonist was sitting on the floor when she addressed him. Jessie looked forward in fear as she asked the master to wake up, adding that the boss was approaching. The snake quickly approached the girl. A barrier appeared above Jessie as she used the sacred shield technique. The snake bit into the dome with its teeth. The girl looked scared as she asked the master to get up. Chuck was sitting near the wall and snoring. Jessie ran as the snake broke the barrier. She crouched down, putting the staff behind her back. The girl looked forward in concern. The snake's tail appeared in front of her. Jessie arched her back and screamed. After the impact, rock fragments appeared. The girl closed her eyes and called out to the master. The protagonist was visible from around the corner. Jessie put her hand in front of her and started begging the owner to get up. Her staff rushed forward. Chuck suddenly opened his eyes. He put his palm to the stone. Sharp spikes pierced the snake's body. Jessie ran away, screaming loudly. There were pieces of stone scattered everywhere in the cave. The girl smiled, standing in front of the guy, who asked if he had dozed off, to which she replied that he had fallen asleep while hunting the boss. Chuck brought his hand to the system window when he said that he was already level 50, and then asked what level the girl was. Jessie smiled awkwardly and replied that she was still level 46. The protagonist yawned and said that then he would sleep a little more, and she could increase her level or skills. Then the girl asked him not to worry and wished him sweet dreams. Chuck opened his mouth and began to speak seriously. He was standing in front of Jessie when he asked her why her head felt so heavy. The girl touched her hair and suggested that it was because she was tired. A staff was sticking out of the back of the protagonist's head when he asked her if she really thought so. Chuck opened his mouth and yawned when he said that he was going to lie down for a while. There was a flash under the roof of the cave. The staff fell in front of Jessie. The girl grinned when she thought about feeling a sense of relief. The lights were on in the multi-story buildings. The TV screen was glowing in Chuck's room in the real world. An icon of a rabbit appeared on the display. The guy opened a soda when the connection was made. Chuck brought the bottle to his face when someone asked who it was. Dice appeared next to the rabbit when the protagonist was greeted. Chuck, smiling, looked ahead when he asked the rabbit how she was doing, adding that they hadn't seen each other for a long time. The protagonist was sitting in front of the TV when Rabbit asked how he was doing, adding that it had been almost 3 years. Then Chuck replied that he was doing well, and then asked if she was still spending her days in Bali. The rabbit icon appeared when the guy was told that she liked it there and was invited to come visit sometime, adding that he would be shown the island. The protagonist's mouth dropped open when he answered that he was just planning to in the near future, and then added that he had a task for Rabbit. The blue icon appeared again when he was asked if this was true and what kind of task it was for a second-rate hacker like her. Then she asked if Chuck would come there all the way from Korea. The guy replied that he needed from her what she had done 3 years ago. A girl was sitting in front of the computer monitors when he said that napalm needed to be hacked. She smiled and put her finger on the card when she asked the guy what kind of business he was doing there. The girl stood in front of the snake's body. Jessie looked ahead in fascination, thinking that if she got junk again this time, she would have to take items from the enemy and that she could sell all the little things for gold coins. A glowing egg appeared when she said that she was seeing it for the first time. A system window appeared, which said that she had received the Basilisk summoner beast. Jessie held the egg in her hands when she asked if it was really him. Cracks appeared on the shell. A black snake appeared above the girl. The green-eyed Basilisk looked at Jessie. A blush appeared on his face. The girl looked ahead with disdain when she thought about how she was already shaking from the snakes and said that this was mockery. The Basilisk in front of her cried when she told it to get back down since she wasn't going to summon it. Jessie smiled as she thought about enjoying her personal time. Small houses were everywhere in the underground city. The girl was standing in front of the system window when she thought that everything seemed almost ready and decided to give it a try. Someone touched her shoulder and spoke to her. Jessie turned around and looked back. The 3 players were looking forward angrily. The girl's face showed fear as she thought about whether the player killers had come and whether she could handle them alone. Her fingers tightened around the staff. She stood in front of the players who apologized for disturbing her. The guy smiled awkwardly and asked if she could help them. Jessie looked forward confused and asked again. They were walking along the large stones. The guy turned to the girl and explained that they wanted to do a quest to change classes for the second time, but they couldn't find a healer, and with 1 potion, nothing worked. Jessie smiled and closed her eyes as she replied that she had thought that they were player killers. The guy looked at her in shock and asked again. Behind Jessie stood a player who said that there seemed to be a misunderstanding. Clouds were floating above the stones when they explained to her that there was an unspoken rule in the underground city. Then she asked again. The guy looked ahead arrogantly and replied that players of the priest rank were not killed. They passed by the stones when he added that the population of this city was not distinguished by the presence of abilities, and that even in an ordinary city it was difficult to find a priest, and even more so there. The guy smiled kindly as he explained that this was why such a rule was introduced, hoping to prevent cases of priests leaving the city. Jessie was walking behind the 3 players when someone exclaimed that they were there and that everyone should get ready. A system announcement appeared, stating that this was a ruined sand palace, and that the quest rank was epic with a recommended level of 55. The players stopped in front of a tall gate. Inside were majestic columns when someone asked how they dared to set their filthy feet on the grounds of his palace. The skull-wearing Sully, who was the king of the desert, exclaimed that they were vile mortals. The players looked ahead warily. Sully was hovering in the air in front of them. The king of the desert raised his hands and commanded his warriors to rise. Creatures began to emerge from the ground. The monsters walked one after another. The creatures with long ears rushed forward when Sully commanded them to bring him the souls of these mortals. The king of the desert stood with his arms outstretched. He disappeared, leaving a whirlwind of sand. Jessie stared ahead when she thought it was a cutscene. Then she realized she had been playing while skipping entire sections of the main plot. Someone swung a sword at her. Suddenly, the blades crossed. A knight appeared in front of the girl, telling the healer to step aside, adding that they would sort it out themselves. Jessie opened her mouth in confusion, exclaiming that it was no problem. The player raised his sword above himself and used the taunt provocation technique. A shockwave attacked the monsters. The creatures surrounded the knight. A stone spike entered the monster's mouth. Tendrils appeared from the player's armor when he used the thorn armor skill. White energy enveloped the staff. A magic circle appeared under the player when he used the ice thirst technique. Ice crystals attacked the monsters. The creatures lined up in several rows. The guy pulled the bowstring and said that it was his turn now. Many arrows flew off him when he used the arrow rain technique. The arrows flew over the monsters. One of them pierced the creature's head. The players approached Jessie. There were remains of monsters on the floor. The girl looked surprised when she said that it was amazing. Then the player said that the three of them easily reached the boss room. In front of the knight stood a guy who said that now they have a healer with them, so it will not be difficult to destroy the boss, when another player said that the problem is in the boss itself. The players smiled cheerfully when they exclaimed that they will take the girl to the battle site, adding that she should consider it a tour. Jessie closed her eyes and agreed. A glowing sphere appeared 2 hours later in the boss room. Skull looked ominous when he asked how dare they. The players held out their weapons in front of them when they exclaimed that this is the last move, and that they cannot relax. Above the king of the desert was a glowing sphere. The guy with dreadlocks opened his mouth wide and said it was a sandstorm, then told everyone to stand behind him. The guy with the bow looked scared. The other player clutched a staff in his hand. Sally had a crown on her skull. A whirlwind of sand appeared. The guy in armor turned his back when he realized it was too late. He closed his eyes, thinking that they were almost done. Suddenly, he opened one eye. Jessie appeared in front of him, using the skill Sacred Shield. The players smiled in relief and told the healer that it was great. Sand appeared in front of the girl when she replied that she couldn't hold out for long. She turned to the guy with dreadlocks, who asked to trust him with this task. He frowned when he used the skill barrier shield. A protective dome appeared above the players. Sally looked straight ahead. 4 players appeared in front of him. The guy with the staff smirked as he exclaimed that it was time to finish him off. The other player pulled back his bowstring and wished death on the boss. Arrows flew in all directions. The Desert King raised his hands up. Sally looked ahead thoughtfully as he realized that everything was in vain. The Desert King began to disappear, thinking about his glory. A system notification appeared saying that the boss monster Desert King Sally had been defeated. The guy in armor raised his hands up joyfully. The 3 players began to hug each other. They were standing in front of Jessie. The boys turned to one side, smiling. The joyful girl looked ahead as she realized that this is why the game is so fun. Suddenly, a system window appeared in front of her. In the system notification, someone asked where she was, adding that she needed to quickly go there. The players were standing in front of Jessie as she thought that of course, even this beautiful moment would not last long. Chuck looked down with displeasure and asked where she had been. The girl awkwardly touched her hair when she answered that she had joined another group and walked through the dungeon. Then the guy asked if that was really true. He patted her head and praised her. Jessie looked forward with concern when she thought that this was some kind of strange reaction. In front of her stood the protagonist, who asked if she had become friends with them, to which the girl answered in the affirmative, adding that they had sent a friend request. Chuck touched his chin when he exclaimed that this was great and that everything was going according to plan, and then added that everyone wanted to be friends with the healer after all. They stood opposite each other when Jessie asked if this was good news for him. The protagonist closed his eyes when he explained that the cost of completing the quest for a secondary class change was 25,000 shame points. Then the girl asked again and exclaimed that this was a lot. He pictured the scruffy houses as he explained that for her information, it would cost 50,000 to change classes for the 3rd time and a whopping 100,000 for the 4th. Chuck opened his palm as he asked where he would get such a huge amount of money. Jessie stood in front of him, suggesting that he should be naughty, and then asked him what he meant, to which he replied that the highest amount of shame points was given for killing a player. The girl looked ahead in fear as she realized what he wanted to do. The protagonist grinned creepily as he asked her if she would introduce him to her new friends. Dark clouds appeared over the trees in the enchanted forest. Jessie smiled pleasantly and thanked them for coming. The 3 players smiled back and said that it was not necessary, and that everything was fine, adding that if the healer herself called them, they would come without hesitation. The boys stood in front of a girl who said she needed to get to the eastern city of Solitera and that she was worried about going alone, but then remembered them and decided to contact them. The players looked in the same direction when they said that they needed to go there too, and that since it was a coincidence, they would also check the portal and see the city, adding that everything coincided perfectly. Sweat broke out on Jessie's face when she said that it was a relief for her. Instead of players, dark silhouettes appeared, thinking how lucky they were that she called them first, and that they finally had a healer on their team. They walked past the trees when someone exclaimed that they were ready to accompany her even to the edge of the eastern continent, and that then they should go. Clouds hung over the forest. The girl took a step when someone said that since no game had ever gone by without incidents due to their carelessness, they decided to take it slow this time and started playing Wings. Jessie was walking in the middle when the guy explained to her that when they came to their senses, it turned out that they had gotten caught up in a fight with killing players again. That's how they had collected shame points and then settled in the underground city. One player turned to her and asked why the healer was there, and she asked him again. The guy stood to the side of her when he explained that it didn't look like she was killing players either, and then asked how she had accumulated shame points. Jessie smiled awkwardly when she answered that she had simply started with a friend and because of him, the points had accumulated. The guy in armor turned his head to them when he said that they also always forget about these rules and get into fights, and this friend was originally a quiet one and only recently suddenly started waving his fists. The guy looked away worriedly. All three looked back when he asked where he went. The guy with bangs opened his mouth and suggested that maybe someone called him, adding that he always disappears somewhere during raids too. They were standing in the trees when the player said that he was a fool and that he should at least warn them when he leaves. Then the other guy apologized to the healer and said that he would go look for him. Jessie opened her mouth and said that no problem. There was a dense forest everywhere when someone asked where he disappeared to. The knight looked at his comrade with displeasure and asked to try calling him. The guy was looking at the system window when he replied that he was said to be unavailable. Then the other player suggested that he had logged out. The guy put his hand to his mouth and objected that he was online. They were standing opposite each other when the knight suggested that he might have been attacked by a monster. Then the comrade replied that there were none in the area. The guy looked ahead suspiciously when he admitted that he could have been dragged away by a ghost. He threw his hands up sharply when he exclaimed that he could have been grabbed like that. The player with dreadlocks looked ahead in fear when he said that something appeared behind his comrade. The guy looked ahead with disdain when he said that this was nonsense. A dark entity appeared behind him when he asked about whether his comrade really thought he would fall for his trick. Dark energy grabbed the player. It pulled him up, then he screamed. In front of the guy in armor, his comrade was pulled into the forest. He looked back as he turned to the healer and told her to stand behind him, explaining that there was something there. There was no one behind him, so he called the healer again. The protagonist smiled 10 minutes earlier. The silhouettes of the players were visible in front of him when he realized that Jessie had lured them. Chuck looked at his hand when he used the Dark Hand technique, then a system notification appeared that with the Dark Knight's Dark Hand skill, one of the skills can be used: shield, grab, or claw. The blue hand rushed forward when the guy used the grab skill, then a notification appeared that this skill grabs the target and pulls it to the user. Silhouettes could be seen among the trees. The last player turned around. He was grabbed by a dark hand. There was no one behind the players. The dark hand held him in the air when he asked what it was. Chuck smiled and replied that it was player assassination. The protagonist appeared behind him when he used the dark continuous strike skill. Chuck opened his mouth and said that the first one is ready. There were tree trunks everywhere when someone said that something strange appeared behind them. Sweat appeared on the player's face. The guy looked ahead with disdain and said that this was nonsense. A dark hand appeared behind him when he asked about what his friend thought he would fall for this. It pulled him away, then he screamed. Chuck raised his sword up when he said that the second one was ready too. The player fell to the ground, groaning. The knight held his shield in front of him when he asked the healer about where she was and exclaimed that they were attacked. He walked towards the protagonist when he thought that it seemed like a defender and that he would not be able to defeat him with one blow. His stat bar appeared when he realized that about half of his HP remained. Chuck crouched near a bush. He stood in front of the knight when he decided that it was enough. The player looked ahead in shock when he asked the healer about where she was. The protagonist was heading towards him. He had a blade in his hand. The guy looked ahead worriedly when he asked if it was really him. Chuck smiled contentedly when he was asked if it was really him who attacked his comrades. The protagonist ran towards the knight. Sweat was pouring down the player's face when he thought about what kind of skill it was. A glow appeared around him when he used the skill defensive stance, thinking that he should use defense first. Chuck looked away, thinking that in front of the dark aura, all defensive skills lose their power. He attacked the knight from different sides. The player gritted his teeth when he thought about who he was and how he managed to damage him, adding that it was too dangerous. He put his foot to the side when he decided what he would do in such a case. A blue aura enveloped him when he used the skill shield charge. Chuck dodged his attack. The protagonist looked away when he realized that it would be easy to avoid such attacks. He struck the knight when he exclaimed that his sides were vulnerable. The dreadlocked player smirked when he realized that Chuck had been caught, explaining that it was just a distraction to close the distance between them. The knight held his shield out in front of him when he decided it was time to go with the heavy artillery. An explosion occurred in front of the protagonist when the shield strike skill was used. The dreadlocked player smiled when he said that his intense training had not been in vain. He suddenly looked forward in fear. Chuck held his shield out in front of him when he exclaimed that his shield was also good. A system notification appeared, mentioning the Dark Hand skill shield, which protects against one enemy strike. The protagonist stood in front of the armored player, who asked if he had blocked his strike, adding that it was impossible. The dreadlock guy frowned as he exclaimed that he had never seen such a brazen scam. Dark energy appeared around his hand. The player opened his mouth wide and asked who he was. Chuck opened his palm. The knight covered himself with a shield as he used the dark hand skill claw. The guy frowned deeply. Dark energy enveloped him as he wondered what was going on since he couldn't see or move. A system notification appeared saying that the dark hand skill claw immobilizes the enemy for 1 second and blinds them for 3 seconds. Chuck smiled with satisfaction as he thought about how the damage would increase by 1.5 times later. The protagonist appeared behind the player when he realized that no matter how skilled a warrior he was, he couldn't withstand such a strong blow. The knight was attacked from different sides, then he screamed. He fell to the ground in front of Chuck. The protagonist looked ahead confidently as he said that this was the 3rd time and that it was easy. The player's body was lying in front of him as he added that he was a loser and that there was no place for meager moves in player assassination mode. The dreadlock guy's eyes widened as Chuck told Jessie that it was her turn. The player looked ahead worriedly. The girl looked guilty as the knight told her to run because that guy was so strong. The protagonist kicked him and asked him to shut up. Jessie held her staff in front of her as the knight told her to quickly run away from that bastard. Her fingers clenched the staff. A magical seal appeared around her as she used the resurrection skill. A system notification appeared, saying that this skill gives life force to an ally in the state of death. The air glowed as the knight asked the healer not to do it there. Dead comrades appeared next to him. They looked forward in shock and said that this could have consequences, then one of them asked if the healer had resurrected them. A system window appeared, saying that the consequences of this skill were that the user's HP would be restored by 5%, and that all subsequent actions would be limited in the form of slowness, and that the remaining time was 179 seconds. Chuck approached them, saying that if users killed each other, the winner would take half of the shame points from the loser. Dark energy appeared around the blade, as he added that this meant that it was possible to save the killed user and kill them again several times, thereby taking all of their shame points. The protagonist held the sword out to the side as he asked them to count. Sweat appeared on the players' faces. Birds flew over the trees. There were dark clouds in the sky when the guy added 38-0, 19-0, 950, and 475, then added 237.5, rounding it up to 238. The players were lying in front of them when Chuck asked Jessie how much the total came to. The girl with her eyes closed answered that it was 7,363. The protagonist looked at the system window, smiling, when he said that earning shame points was quite easy. They were standing in front of the players' bodies when he thanked them, adding that thanks to them, he was able to accomplish what he had planned. The guy with dreadlocks opened his mouth and asked why he was doing this. Chuck stood in front of them and replied that he had no personal grudge against them, and that he just needed the shame points. He placed his hand on Jessie's head when he asked them if they agreed that he had taught them a good lesson. The protagonist pointed forward and exclaimed that one should never look at someone else's healer. Tears appeared in the girl's eyes as she apologized. The players looked forward with disdain as they thought that she seemed very nice and that they would never think that she was in league with this psycho, adding that there was a reason he was operating in the underground city. Chuck waved at them and exclaimed that since the points had been increased, they had nothing more to do there, and then added that they would see each other in the underground city. The boys looked forward in horror as he asked them to save up more shame points, adding that he would come for them. Chuck and Jessie walked far away from them. When they were out of sight, the knight turned to his comrade. His back was to them when he suggested leaving the underground city, adding that it was impossible to survive there if you fight the players one-on-one. The guy turned his head to the side and agreed with him. Jessie was walking next to Chuck when the player added that the bastard was no different from a demon. The sun was shining on the buildings of the underground city. System notifications appeared that they had fulfilled the conditions of the 3rd level Demon King and that the 3rd level indicators were unlocked. A system notification appeared that at level 1, attack power increases by 0.1% of the total amount of shame points. At level 2, HP increases by 1% of the total amount of shame points, and at level 3, magic defense increases by 0.05% of the total amount of shame points. Chuck looked at the system window with interest when he said that it was great because now he had some magic protection. He turned to the girl and called her. Jessie hugged her knees, crying when she exclaimed that they trusted her, then Chuck asked about her. Crying was heard in the underground city. The girl cried, hugging her legs, when the guy asked about her. She realized that they trusted her. Jessie remembered the sand castle, in which someone exclaimed that a unique item appeared. The players were in front of her when she was asked about where she was. The guys looked at the staff in admiration when they said that it was really unique and that it was very cool. A system notification appeared that this was the power of the king of the desert. The guy looked down in fascination. He closed his eyes. The player turned to his comrades. He took a step forward. Jessie looked at his hand in surprise when he said he didn't need it and offered the healer the staff. The other players looked shocked. A scream was heard in the sandcastle when they asked if he was serious. The boy stood in front of Jessie when he explained that without the healer's help, he would never have gotten it. He placed the staff in her hand. The boy smiled warmly when he added that in return, he asked her to help them out sometimes. The girl, looking ahead in amazement, replied that it was no problem for her. The players smiled happily when they exclaimed that they hoped they would work together. A sad Jessie held the staff in her hands when she was asked why she was so sad. Chuck stood in front of her, who said that the underground city was a place for anonymous users, so they were all bad guys, adding that only a fool would trust a stranger he met for the first time. The girl looked down guiltily when she answered that they were counting on her after all, but she betrayed them, and that they asked to kill them, but she, on the contrary, resurrected them. The protagonist looked at her impatiently and asked her to listen to him carefully, and then explained that while she was his companion, she would have tasks many times more difficult. Tears appeared in the girl's eyes when she asked him again. Chuck grabbed her by the shoulder when he answered that, of course, after all, their goal was to destroy the world, and then added that it would be an incredible sight and that it would be mean and disgusting. The staff's coating flashed when the girl said that they even gave her a unique item. The protagonist snatched the staff and answered that it was some kind of level 50 item, and that only maximum level artifacts had value. Chuck looked at the item in shock when he asked if this was really the real power. A system window appeared, listing the characteristics of this item: rank, unique, item level, 50, durability, 25 out of 25, damage, from 100 to 250, and plus 20 points to intelligence and magic power. The protagonist held the staff in his hands when he explained that this item was once considered a luxury, and then asked about the fact that they really gave it to her, adding that it seemed like they really liked her a lot. Sweat appeared on his face when he fell silent. Jessie grabbed her hair when she exclaimed that if they gave her such a good thing, it means they were good people. Chuck looked in her direction when he asked her not to cry, because the staff was considered such 5 years ago and now no one needs it. The space around the item sparkled as the boy thought that, frankly, it was still considered a good item to this day and that it could be used up to level 70, although it would last for healers up to 90 if they used the buff. Chuck brought his fist to his face and coughed when he decided that she didn't need to know that. He stood in front of the girl when he said that he was sleepy, so he would go lie down for a while, and then asked her if she had reached level 50. The protagonist stood with his back to her when she answered that she had. Then he told her to get a quest for a second class change and run through the dungeon a few more times. Jessie sat, looking ahead in amazement when he added that she needed to find other teams, because she wouldn't rest until she helped everyone in the world. Then she assumed that those teams would die too. Chuck smiled as he replied that she was right and that they would meet the same fate as those boys. He turned to the girl sitting behind him as he explained that 2 or 3 more times and then they would be able to change classes again, and then they would go level up again. The protagonist began to disappear as he summed up that while he was gone, she needed to find a few more teams. Saddened, Jessie laid her head on her knees as she suggested that perhaps the owner had decided that having such a quality as humanity was not at all necessary. She bent her index finger as she chose to use the fishing rod and decided that she needed to calm down first. Between the houses, a waterfall was visible. A float was floating on the water. The girl sat on the bank, consoling herself with the fact that it was just a game and that she was helping the owner. The players approached her from behind and addressed her. They smiled warmly and said hello, and then asked if she was a healer. Jessie turned her head towards them when they explained that they were going to the dungeon for a second class change, but they didn't have a healer. She looked back with disdain when they asked if she could help them. The girl turned away from them silently. The boy smiled awkwardly when he added that if she was busy now, then they could come later. Jessie sat with her back to them and said nothing. Then someone suggested leaving, adding that she wouldn't agree. The players stood behind her when they apologized for disturbing her, then she asked if they minded. They looked in the same direction, surprised, and asked again. Jessie had a fishing rod in front of her when she asked if they really wanted to invite her to their team. The players stood behind her when they answered that of course, and that there was no need to ask, adding that they were even asking her to join. The girl's mouth slightly opened when she said that she agreed, and that she also needed to change classes. The float sank under the water. Jessie pulled the fish she had caught out of the water. The players looked forward when she said that she was interested in something. The girl smiled sweetly and asked how many shame points they had. Gaia folded her hands in front of her when she said that it was not yet time to implement an in-game payment system, and that if they added it now, the financial difference between the players would be huge, which could eventually lead to regular users leaving the game. Then she was interrupted and asked about the fact that no one had asked her about this. Nate was standing in front of the screens when he said that he was interested in when he would be able to increase his revenue by selling items and register the system to play big. The blonde closed her eyes and apologized when she explained that it was difficult for her to answer his question due to the constant changes in the stock market. The guy with glasses looked askance. He stopped in front of Gaia when he cursed and said that she was the best AI in the world and that he had invested a lot of money in her, and all she kept saying was that she knew nothing. Nate swung at her when he said that he always wondered if hitting an AI would make him feel bad. The blonde smiled kindly and said no, and that he could hit her as much as he wanted if violence would help him get rid of his anger. The guy turned away when he laughed and said that it was a joke and that he was not some kind of scumbag. Nate pressed the button on the phone and then someone answered that they were ready to listen to the director. A smile appeared on the guy's face when he asked the manager to gather all the department heads. The blue sky was reflected in the windows of the Napalm headquarters. The employees were walking one after another. The girl turned around when she was addressed. She turned away from Ron, who asked what the unscheduled meeting was about, to which she replied that she had no idea and that he had become too talkative since becoming CEO. The guy stood behind Chloe, who added that she found his unpredictability very annoying. Nate crossed his arms when he announced that they would be changing their rates and implementing a cash system starting next Monday. There were people at the table who asked him to repeat himself. Ron looked away in confusion when he asked why he had spoken so abruptly, adding that he was sure the users would be upset. The guy with glasses touched his chin and spoke thoughtfully about the dissatisfaction of the users. Ron looked at him with concern when he asked about how Chuck had treated them. Nate put his hands on the table when he said that it seemed like he had influenced them to some extent, and then asked how he had treated the users. Ron looked away when he said that CEO Chuck called them hunters. He pictured the player with the axe when he said that he called them hunters who would go on an adventure through the world they created, and that they were the supports who would help them on their adventure. The guy with the glasses opened his mouth when he repeated the word hunters. Then he covered his mouth with his hand. The employees' faces sweated when the CEO laughed. He held his hand to his mouth when he said that was why the company's profits were so worthless. The employees at the table in front of him when he asked them to remember that today's users would be cattle. Chloe sat behind Ron when she asked about what the CEO had said. Nate held his hand out when he said that they were their livestock that they would raise in the pigsty, and that they were like pigs who cheered when you threw them feed. The man looked away with concern when the director asked if they thought he was being over the top with his expressions. The bespectacled employee looked askance when Nate added that he didn't think so and that they would figure it out soon. He smiled creepily when he said that there would naturally be resentment against the cash, so he offered to throw in some food. The man looked away with fear when the director turned to the head of the planning department. Nate turned towards him when he asked him to top up the balance of users with an active subscription according to its validity period, and also to make it so that they could buy half of the goods with game currency. The director stood next to him when he added that they needed to give out 2-week boosters of productivity experience points to all users, and that they needed to appease them with goodies first. Chloe opened her mouth wide and asked him to wait, and then asked if perhaps it was still not worth doing so hastily. The CEO held his hand out to the side and asked him to listen, then asked him why the game wasn't making money. Nate clenched his fists in front of him as he asked why the game was barely making it to number 5 in revenue among virtual products when it was number 1 in the world among users. The employees sat silently at the table as he answered that there was only one reason, and that it was all because of their incompetence. Chloe looked away seriously as the CEO added that Chuck was the biggest loser. Nate put his fist on the table as he asked why the users were called hunters when it was just a game, just fun. The CEO looked away with disdain as he added that this wasn't the real world, but a fake one, and that it was some kind of amusement park. He slammed his hand on the table as he exclaimed that this was why users had to pay not only for entry. Nate glared ahead as he exclaimed that they needed to add paid drinks, food, and merchandise, and that they needed to sell everything they could, even their souls, and then cursed. The employees looked horrified. The CEO straightened his jacket and apologized, explaining that he was a little on edge. He stood at the head of the table as he asked if it was true that they hadn't gotten a bonus in a while, and when the last one had been, then suggested that it was during the launch of the game. The people looked to one side in confusion as he promised them more money than they had before if they did as he said. The employee with glasses looked incredulous as the CEO added that the bonuses would be substantial. Chloe and Ron looked at the other employees in disgust. Nate clapped as he suggested that they all do their best, adding that he would be looking forward to their suggestions for items in the game. He walked past the staff as he announced that the launch was the following Monday and that there were 5 days left, adding for everyone to be aware that they would be changing the settings to F2P immediately. The director's mouth dropped open as he announced that Season 6 would be starting in 3 weeks, and that the 100% boost voucher would be on sale at the same time. The staff looked in one direction emotionlessly as Nate asked about the fact that it seemed like they didn't have a name for the item yet. A glow appeared behind him as he said that the game was called Wings, and then suggested that they call the item the wings of a goddess. The staff member gave them a thumbs up and exclaimed that that was a very good name. Nate's back was turned as he replied that that was great and asked them to get back to work, saying that he still had to see the directors. The staff continued to sit around the table in silence. Suddenly, they began discussing how much the bonus was during the launch of the game and how the director said he would pay more. Chloe and Ron looked away with disdain. The protagonist raised his hands up when he said that he slept for 10 hours and felt great. Jessie turned around and looked at him. She started waving her arms and legs when she asked the owner if he was already there, then he asked if something happened. The girl put her hand to her mouth and answered that it happened, and then asked if the owner heard the news. There was a scream near the houses when she explained that starting next Monday the game would be free and there would be paid items, and that Nate was the new director. Then Chuck asked if the announcement had appeared, adding that he had come up with something again. They were standing in front of the system window when the guy said that they were faster than he thought. Jessie looked at the protagonist thoughtfully when she assumed that he must have been upset because he was against cash items. Chuck was standing next to the girl when he said that it was good. Then she asked him again. He touched the system window, which said about partial payment, and that within 2 weeks you can try the booster of points and increase in productivity. Then he said that after the 70th level the game becomes very difficult, and he was just racking his brains, thinking about how to develop further, adding that if he uses the booster of experience points, he will be able to calmly increase his level before the beginning of the 6th season. Jessie looked ahead with interest when he said that, in addition, there are many useful items for cash and that it has become much better. The air around Chuck sparkled when she thought that it was not that he was upset, but, on the contrary, the owner was going to actively use these innovations. The girl looked ahead with pity when she realized that now for him any change is a means to an end. Then the guy asked her about what she did while he was gone. She looked at the protagonist with confusion, who asked if she had undergone a secondary class change. They were standing in front of the houses when Jessie answered yes, explaining that she had also met 3 new teams and reached level 55. The boy placed his hand on her head and praised her. Chuck gripped the hilt of his blade as he began to speak. He pulled the sword out of its sheath as he exclaimed that they would now take turns harvesting her new friends. A scream was heard from the trees in the enchanted forest. Jessie was sitting near the trunk of a tree. Sweat broke out on her face as the scream was heard. She was holding knitting needles as she called herself stupid. The girl sat with her eyes closed as she said that she had missed a stitch. Then someone asked her to stop. Jessie suddenly turned around and put her hat in her inventory as the boy exclaimed that it was her turn. In front of her were players who were asking the healer not to come near and to run away from there. Her eyes widened as she thought about how she needed to practice knitting more. A golden glow appeared when the resurrection skill was implemented. Then the players shouted loudly. A system notification appeared, which listed the user's characteristics. Then Chuck exclaimed that the goal was achieved. He looked at Jessie, who was happy when he said that since all the conditions were met, it was time for the second class change. Then the girl asked him to be careful. He raised his hand to the system window, which asked if he wanted to accept the quest called Second Class Change the Demon King's Heir 3. Chuck turned to Jessie when he said that she would go with him this time, since it was a team quest. Then the girl exclaimed that it was good. The injured players were lying in front of the portal. There was a dark sky above the forest when they said that they were worse than demons. The knight in black armor put his hands forward and greeted the rising deity of the dark religion. Chuck stood in front of him when he said that his shame points were enough to get the next class. Tyrael looked ahead as he added that in order to reach a high rank, the boy would have to pass the tests. Chuck and Jessie stood before him as he informed him that it would not be easy and then asked if he was ready for them. The protagonist smiled haughtily as he replied that the harder the trials, the more valuable they were. Thuriel looked ahead as he replied that he was right in calling him the new star of the dark religion. The armored knight clapped his hands. A passage opened up near them. They stood looking down the stairs. The armored being looked ahead confidently as he suggested that they begin the trials. A system notification called Event Dungeon appeared, asking if they wanted to begin the trial of evil, and mentioned that this dungeon had a high difficulty level, so they should check the item level and try to complete the dungeon in a team of 2 or more people. An elegant chandelier hung from the ceiling. Jessie turned her head to the side as she said that this was more like a room than a dungeon. An armored character appeared in front of them. The girl grabbed the owner's cloak and spoke to him. The man held a blade in his hand when she added that it was one of the 3 warriors who defeated the dark religion 100 years ago and brought peace to the continent. The man's eyes were empty when the guy said that it was the Sword King Cadmos. Chuck began to pull the sword out of its sheath when Jessie asked if it was really such a great character, to which he replied that no, and that it was his shadow. The guy imagined blue silhouettes when he explained that the dark religion created the shadows of the warriors who defeated it, and the Dark Knights learned the attack tactics of the 3 warriors by fighting their shadows. Cadmos approached them when he clarified that this is what the story says, and he thought about the fact that they had simply used existing NPCs because they were too lazy to model new ones. Chuck remembered the sweat running down his face when he asked the head of the graphics department to finally make new characters, to which she replied that she had too much to do. Cadmos looked forward with disdain. The protagonist held out his sword as he asked the girl to get ready, explaining that this character was set to level 50, but combat AIs were usually of the highest level. Then Jesse asked him again. Cadmos rushed forward. Chuck opened his palm, using the Dark Hand skill. The enemy swung his blade. Cadmos attacked the protagonist's shield as he exclaimed that they were on a completely different level from everyone they had fought before. Cadmos gripped the hilt of the blade with both hands. He stood in front of the protagonist. Chuck gritted his teeth, thinking that in addition to his agility points, he had all the other indicators at the highest level. The tip of the blade flashed. The protagonist dodged the attacks, realizing that the blows were too fast and that they were difficult to parry, and if he tried to get away, then the enemy quickly caught up. Cadmos continued swinging his sword as Chuck decided that he would have to hold on as he was for now. A bar appeared that showed less than half of his HP. The protagonist crossed his arms in front of him as he realized that he was a warrior who fought with only his own strength and decided that he could handle some fast swordsmen. The opponents froze in front of each other. Cadmos continued to look at Chuck, who thought that one round was over and that it was his turn now. The protagonist opened his mouth wide and asked Jessie to heal him. She was watching the fight when she exclaimed that she had already started and that she would add another buff to him. The girl hugged her staff to herself as system notifications appeared that Swordsman's Blessing increased a team member's strength, that Guardian Angel's Aura increased a team member's health, and that Wind Melody increased a team member's agility. Satisfied, Chuck smiled and exclaimed that everything was fine and that it was not bad. The protagonist charged towards the enemy using the Dark Aura technique. Cadmos was attacked from different directions when Chuck used the Dark Sequential Strike skill. The protagonist looked ahead worriedly. The enemy was standing in front of him when he cursed and suggested that the problem was with the agility points since he had not hit even once. Then he added that there was too much of a difference in their agility scores, so a penalty was imposed. Chuck looked away when he decided that he needed to make up for this deficiency with items, noticing that he was focusing too much on just leveling up. Cadmos smiled ominously. The protagonist clutched his sword in his hand when he asked if he found it funny. He looked ahead menacingly when he wondered how a creation could laugh at its creator. His pupils narrowed when he added that he would torture him properly. Cadmos looked ahead attentively. Chuck turned away from him when he said that he would do it later. He ran past Jessie when he said he needed to buy some equipment. She clutched the staff in front of her and asked him again when he asked to replace it for now for 3 minutes. The armored opponent walked towards her. The girl looked forward in fear when she asked what was going on and why such a hopeless situation had happened again. She clutched the staff in her hand when a notification appeared saying that the weapon defense was successful. Cadmos carried out a series of strikes when many notifications appeared saying that the weapon defense was successful. Jessie covered one eye when she thought about the probability of reducing weapon defense is 40%, and that if you add 60% of the strike, she will not last long. The opponent clutched the blade with both hands and froze. Tears appeared in the girl's eyes when she realized that she lasted only 1 round. Then she decided that she needed to recover as much as possible while there was a minute. She spread her arms out to the sides and used the healing wave skill. Jessie turned around as she asked the owner what if she really died. Chuck peeked around the corner and asked him to rub some more, then she asked him to help her quickly. Cadmos moved forward. He struck, then Jessie screamed. She was standing with her back turned when she parried the attack. Fear was reflected on her face. The girl held the staff in front of her when she realized that she was at her limit and that she could not take it anymore. Cadmos hovered above her in the air. Jessie looked ahead carefully when she realized something. Dust rose from a powerful blow. The girl held the dagger in front of her when the system reported that the defense against the weapon was successful. Then she exclaimed that this was the entrance of a newbie dagger with a 100% chance of damage. Cadmos gritted his teeth in frustration. Suddenly, the blade of the dagger broke. A system alert appeared that the weapon's durability was too low and that the equipment was destroyed. Jessie looked at the dagger's fragment in confusion. She looked ahead in fear. Cadmos grinned maliciously. He ran forward, smiling. Tears appeared in the girl's eyes when she thought that she was finished. A blue aura appeared near the enemy. There was a bright flash. Jessie opened her eyes slightly. She looked at the torn cloak. The knight had a metal helmet. Someone in armor stood in front of the girl. When she assumed that it was the owner, then he praised her, adding that now he would deal with him. Cadmos stood in front of him when he called him a fake warrior. He held the blade in front of him and offered the enemy to try to hit him. Cadmos gritted his teeth in anger. He ran, heading towards the main character. Chuck got into a fighting stance when he promised that this time it would hurt him a lot. The protagonist extended his arm out to the side as he used the Dark Sequential Strike technique. The opponent gritted his teeth in indignation. His body parts flew up. Jessie looked forward in admiration as she realized that he had done it with 1 hit. The master gave the girl a signature gesture as she exclaimed that he was amazing. The face of a new opponent appeared. The girl was standing behind Chuck as she addressed him. A girl in a black dress appeared as he explained that it was the shadow of Allison, the legendary archmage and the second of the three great warriors. A cluster of blue energy appeared above her as he added that the goal of this quest was to destroy the shadows of all three warriors. A confused Jesse stood behind Chuck as she informed the master that if Allison hit him, the blow could hit his head. Then he replied that she was right and that these fireballs were coming in a series of explosions, so the dark hand shield would not stop them. The girl smiled, looking ahead as the protagonist said that he had a secret weapon for this case, then she exclaimed that he always had a way out. A strong energy cluster appeared in front of Allison. Chuck stood in front of Jesse and apologized. The girl looked ahead worriedly. The protagonist lifted her in front of him and used the technique of the shield of the secret friend. The girl opened her mouth wide and screamed. Everything turned blue as she called the owner a bad name. Allison was floating in the air. She stared ahead with a blank look. A knight in a red cloak appeared in front of her. He clutched a sword in his hand as he tied the shield of the friend. The archmage's hacked body began to disappear as Chuck used the dark sequential strike skill. There was a chandelier under the ceiling as he explained that he was a character with only one skill and that he only needed to dodge the fireballs and the game would be over. Jesse's body was lying in front of him as he said that he would not forget her sacrifice, then she asked him to resurrect her quickly. She looked forward in exhaustion when she was asked if she was offended, to which she replied that this was not the first time and asked to just give her some time to prepare. Someone took a step forward. An enemy in a white robe appeared in front of them. Chuck glared angrily as he said that it had begun. The blonde girl walked slowly as the protagonist explained that it was the shadow of the last warrior, Archbishop Eden. Jessie peeked over her master's shoulder and asked what class he was, to which he replied that he was a priest. Adina was approaching them when she exclaimed that it meant he was from the same region as her and that they said that priests were weak in duels, so he would easily deal with her. Chuck gripped his blade with both hands as he replied that she was wrong, because this guy was a battle priest, adding that she was the strongest of the three. The girl looked ahead carefully as she asked if battle priests were really that strong. Adina grabbed her robe. The archbishop tore off her robe as Chuck replied that they weren't so much strong as they were nasty. Jessie brought her hand to her face and asked him again. The girl looked ahead worriedly as she thought about how incredibly built this woman was. Chuck stepped forward and asked her to start casting. Jessie held her staff in front of her as she exclaimed that she was about to begin. The protagonist opened her palm and used the dark hand skill. He swung his hand in front of Eden using the trident technique. A system notification appeared stating that this skill would stun for 1 second and blind for 3 seconds. The archbishop crossed her arms in front of her. Chuck appeared behind her. He struck using the dark attack skill. Eden's HP and MP bars appeared as Chuck realized that he had hit with full force but had only taken off a quarter of his health. The protagonist gritted his teeth in anger. The archbishop grabbed the handle of the weapon. She raised a hammer above herself. The same weapon appeared above Chuck. Jessie looked up in confusion. They were attacked by lightning, then they screamed. A system notification appeared for the Hammer of Dawn skill, which stuns enemies in an area within a 25-meter radius. Adina stood between them when Jessie said that her body was not responding. Then Chuck explained that it was because she was stunned. The archbishop bent her arm in front of her and used the skill Healing Slash, then her HP was restored. The guy was wearing a helmet when he asked if the girl finally understood what he was talking about. Sweat appeared on Jessie's face when she answered in the affirmative. The protagonist stood behind Eden when he explained that she was converting free points into survivability, and that she did not need protection since she already had the best equipment. Then he added that they were dealing with an opponent who had many heals up his sleeve, not counting stuns. That is, in other words, they were dealing with an unkillable priest. The archbishop turned her back when Chuck summed up that the strategy for such types is extremely simple, and that it consists of wearing out your opponent. Jessie looked ahead in fear and asked what they should do then and how they could defeat her. The protagonist looked ahead as he replied that luckily she couldn't restore mana with potions since she was an NPC, so all they had to do was attack until her mana ran out. The girl clutched the staff in front of her as he asked how long it would take to drain her mana. The blade was enveloped in black energy. Chuck loomed over the archbishop as he exclaimed that he wanted to know. Lightning emanated from the hammer. Adina raised the weapon above her. The protagonist looked ahead in anger, thinking about how annoying it was that she had been swinging that hammer for 4 hours. He turned to Jessie, who turned to him and informed him that she had stopped healing. Adina raised her hand up as a bar appeared, showing that her mana was out. A club appeared in the boy's hands when he asked if she was out of breath. They were standing in front of the archbishop when Jessie asked what the owner needed the club for. Adina looked ahead in confusion when he answered that he wanted to show her what it was like to get hit in the head, and then asked if she thought that death by sword would be too lenient. Chuck swung the club when he said that it was time for revenge. Jessie looked ahead in fear, thinking how good it was that she wasn't born an NPC when the protagonist asked the Archbishop if she liked him. A system notification appeared, saying that the class change quest called Demon King's Legacy 3 had been completed, and that they had defeated the shadows of the heroes of the past, including the Sword Lord Cadmos, the Great Mage Allison, and the Archbishop of Eden. Then Chuck exclaimed that the quest was completed. The body of the High Priest was lying in front of them. When he said that it was time to end all this, then the girl asked Eden to rest in peace until the next resurrection. There was no one in the hall when Jessie said that they had come across everyone, a universal swordsman, a mage with one skill, and an unkillable priest. The Archbishop was lying on the floor, beaten. The girl stood behind the protagonist when she asked about the fact that if the NPCs had such settings, then what about the players? Then he asked if she thought about what she was saying. Chuck looked down when the notification appeared that the helmet was hidden and told Jessie to watch the footage of the previous competitions among players later, adding that it was a freak show. He imagined dark silhouettes in front of the big screen when he explained that many people showed up and ruined the perception of the game with their abnormality, although that is why the game is considered so fun, and then added that real martial arts were transferred to the simulation and became considered a world-class esport. Chuck's mouth fell open and concluded that it was a fascinating spectacle back then. Jessie looked ahead sadly. She was walking behind the protagonist when she wondered if he would be happy if the game crashed. They stood in front of Thurial, who congratulated them on completing the game and said that he had no doubt that they could do it. The creature in black armor opened his palm when he announced that Chuck could now lead the Army of Darkness, and that he appointed him as the commander. The system notifications appeared that he had completed the class change quest called Demon King's Legacy 3, and that he had successfully changed his class. Then the system rooms appeared that he had new functions such as developing the Dark Cult base and cultivating the Dark Cult troop, and it was also said that he could now move to the Dark Cult through the underground city. Chuck looked ahead with confidence when the system window appeared, saying that he should develop the base, cultivate troops, and contribute to the Dark Cult, and open the directory for more information. They were standing in front of Thurio when he said that he had now become a commander in the underground city department, so he should devote himself to serving the Great One. The system window appeared in front of the protagonist when he said that many restrictions were removed when changing the second class. Then the girl asked what Thurio meant by the underground city department. Chuck looked back and replied that she would see everything with her own eyes. Tyrio held his hand out in front of him as he wished for the entire continent to know about the Dark Cult. Between the wooden buildings in the underground city, the hooded player was called by the name of Den. He looked away and asked about the one who dared to call his name. The protagonist waved at him and said that they hadn't seen each other for a long time. They were standing in front of him when Den exclaimed that he was glad to greet the commander. Jessie remembered their last meeting when she decided that he didn't remember much, judging by how he wasn't shaking with fear. Chuck looked at Den arrogantly and asked about the location of the Dark Cult's base. The player grinned cheekily as he replied that they had come to the right person, and then asked to follow him. In front of them was a wooden door. Chuck and Jessie stood behind Den. He opened the door slightly. A man was sitting in front of them when the protagonist exclaimed that this was a toilet. He ran away from them, calling them scumbags and adding that even dogs are not touched when they shit. A system notification appeared, asking if they wanted to activate the base. Chuck had a system window in front of him when he thought about the base creation location being randomized and then asked why the worst one came out of all the options. They were standing in front of the toilet when the girl asked him to do it faster. A portal appeared above the hole. The magical passage began to increase. Dan smiled when he exclaimed that it was ready and added that they could go in. Jessie was standing next to Chuck when she said that she felt bad. Stones were visible in the distance. A girl began to appear next to the protagonist when he said something about a randomizer. Chuck opened his mouth wide and screamed. Jessie opened one eye and asked the gentleman where they were. The protagonist looked menacingly from under his brows when he answered that they were in a place where a squad of dark knights was hiding. They were standing in front of a high fence when he added that the branch of the Dark Cult base in the underground city looked abandoned. Jessie asked the gentleman what kind of place it was, and he replied that the army of the Dark Order remained there, after which he added that it was the base of the Dark Order in the underground city, and the artificial intelligence noted that everything there was destroyed. Coming closer, the guys saw a red flag with a raven drawn on it. There, unknown people greeted the army commander. They were Alpha and Beta, who gave their names. They also stated that they were the caretakers of this base, and now that he was the owner of this place, they asked to allow him to explain how this base worked, asking if he was satisfied with it. Thinking, Chuck reflected that although he did this, a lot of time had passed, so he had bad memories, and said that it sounded good. Hearing this, Alpha turned and said that first she needed to explain the basics of working with the base, and asked to follow them. Entering, the assistant explained that the Dark Order's base is located all over the continent, and Beta added that the underground section is only one of them. Pointing to the camp, they explained that, however, as you can see, the equipment there is very crude. Conducting a tour near the weapons workshop, the assistants concluded that they must improve and rebuild this base. While a huge golem was digging ore with a pickaxe, the protagonist was explained that the resources needed to grow the base are mined by it. Pointing to it, Alpha also explained that at the moment they only have one golem, but their number can be increased at the discretion of the army commander. And in addition to stones, golems are also known for chopping wood and mining iron ore, and are also used for a variety of jobs, and the more he invests in getting more, the better. Hearing this, Jesse assumed that they needed to invest, and the assistant confirmed his words, saying that they could invest shame points and gold in developing the facilities here. Inspecting the base, Alpha stated that from the number of golems to the production of troops and upgrading the facilities, everything needed shame points and gold. After listening to his subordinates, the creator of the game asked the artificial intelligence if he now understood why he needed so much shame, and he answered that shame could be used even in this way. Suddenly, unknown creatures approached them, standing nearby. One of them, opening his eyes, noticed strangers right in front of him, which was very surprising. At the same time, a soldier jumped up to him and began to shake him, explaining something in his language. After that, the goblins saluted. Alpha explained that the troops of the Dark Order could be created here. The assistant then explained that training costs shame and gold, and it also takes a certain amount of time, and Chuck had images of all of the above in his head. Looking at his army, he thought that this was still a level 1 barracks, so there were only goblins there. Immediately after that, Alpha, imagining goblins fighting a monster, explained that trained troops can make invasions from clearing the dungeon of a large monster. Let's imagine a situation where they can also attack other people. She added that goblins can rob players or even invade villages. Then the assistant said that fighting large monsters brings gold, and skirmishes with players bring shame, visualizing chests of riches and a wanted poster. Suddenly Beta would intervene in the conversation, explaining that, however, if he carried out a mission that was not in line with the level of the troops, he might fail, which would require the use of funds against his troops, and asked to keep this in mind when carrying out the mission. Finally, they would approach the barracks and explain that all instructions for the base could be given there. Standing near the throne, the assistants would ask the commander to give them an order. Looking at the throne, which was clearly not in good condition, the boy thought about it. Sitting on it, he would remark that it was not bad. Smiling widely, the creator of the game would declare that he liked it. With an expression reminiscent of the devil, the protagonist would remark that he liked the fact that they were starting from the very bottom. Seeing this, Jesse did not know what to do. He looked at his master, who was sitting on an old, worn throne in this simple and rough base. At this point, the AI had the impression that he was the king, and a smiling Chuck asked where they would start. Immediately after this narration, the story moves to the underground city. The unknown person approached people and called out to them, after which he noted that it was very interesting that they were still alive in the underground city with such equipment, which made them very angry. Rubbing his hands, Sam declared that he guaranteed the lowest price in the country and 100% transaction security, so after that they would be able to trade gold very cheaply and become stronger, asking what they thought. After listening to him, the players sighed heavily and said to forget about it, because they do not waste money, which greatly surprised the boy who tried to stop them. Finally, he noted that he does not offer this to anyone, but also accepts power stones instead of gold. Having piqued the interest of the boys, the merchant noted that in their day everything was at max level, so there was no need for boost stones. But if they sold them at the transaction center, they would rip them off for a lot of money, and he would pay handsomely so that they could sell them to him. Hearing this, one of the players asked the other if he had any boost stones, and the other explained that he had a supply in storage. The player then told him to just sell them and upgrade his gear, since he didn't use them anyway, and the other asked if he really should do that. At this time, an unknown person was watching their conversation from the side. After making the exchange, Sam counted from 1 to 10 and was glad that he had exceeded the norm again today, and the boss would definitely like it. Immediately after that, the man in the cloak came down and approached him. He was right behind him. Suddenly, the merchant noticed that someone was approaching him from behind. At that moment, he began to run away, trying to hide around the corner. As Sam continued to run, he wondered who this guy was and why he was chasing him. As he nimbly climbed onto the roof of the house, the salesman reasoned that he would not be able to keep up with this rogue-class body. He then decided to turn around to check the situation. Sam breathed a sigh of relief, thinking that he had broken away from the pursuit, but the unknown person was actually right in front of him. Then, sounds began to be heard in the alley of the city that he had not done anything wrong. Sitting on the roof and shaking with fear, the salesman wondered if there was anything wrong with buying up power stones. At that moment, he received a blow right in the face. Stepping on the opponent's head with his foot, the man in the cloak asked to take him to Sean because he had a question that he wanted to ask him personally. In a desperate situation, Sam decided to take him to his boss, and they walked along the rails. At one point, the merchant stopped and laughed, calling the stranger stupid or strong, which surprised him greatly. Turning around abruptly, he asked who really thought that there would only be one or two of them in their headquarters. A moment later, the bandit called the guys, and they immediately came out to him. Looking at the huge crowd of bandits gathered right in front of him, the stranger silently looked ahead. Suddenly, Sam told him to answer honestly who he even was. Taking off his hood, the guy asked what kind of stupid joke this was. Pointing his blade straight in front of him and exhaling heavily, the killer of the players called them idiots who were just playing, breaking up into groups. Hearing how he called them, the merchant became furious. Calling his opponent a bastard, Sam gave the order to the others to kill him. The father immediately obeyed. The player swung his hammer to strike. At the last moment, the stranger managed to dodge the enemy's lunge, which destroyed everything around. Immediately after this, the next enemy attacked him from the side. The unknown man jerked his head back and dodged his blow. Then, right behind him, another opponent appeared, preparing to strike. Suddenly, the bandit was greatly frightened by the bright blue light he saw in front of him. This light appeared due to the use of the full moon skill used on him. A moment later, the guy delivered his blow directly to the enemy. At that moment, the swordsman was cut in half. His body split into two halves right in the air and quickly fell down. Seeing this blow, one of the bandits declared that it was Kane, and the rest did not understand who he was. Looking at the guy standing right in front of them, he explained that he took second place in the Mudu competition and was a monster hunting bounty hunters. While the unknown man looked at his opponents with an emotionless look, the bandit explained that he was a psychopath, a player killer, a hunter killer Kane. Suddenly, an unknown voice was heard asking everyone to stop, and the bandits immediately obeyed. Then the unknown person came out to them, surprised that it was really Chuck. Smiling, trying to hide his fear, Sean asked how long ago it was and did he really still have the game. Looking at the guest who came to him, he was interested in the fact that they last met last year and noted that he thought he stopped playing because nothing had been heard from him since then. With great fear on his face, the leader of the bandits said that in any case, it was nice to see him again after so many years and wondered why this man suddenly found him. Standing in his place, Kane asked why he suddenly started buying up power stones, which greatly surprised everyone present. Sighing with relief, Sean noted that he was simply curious about the power stones, and that is why he came there. Then he would explain that the Season 6 update was coming soon and he was buying them because he thought the price would go up and he just liked having a strong body because it just felt so good and the other guy would listen to him in silence. After a moment, Kane would ask if he had heard that someone had been fired. The bandit leader would shake his head and say that he had heard of course and he thought he had been fired because that idiot had worked on it. Well, he didn't think he would be thrown out like that. Then he would suddenly ask that he supposedly hated him. Upon hearing this, Kane would smile widely and give a negative answer. Then with an expression full of rage and bloodlust, he would state that he hated him so much that he wanted to kill him. The bandits would sweat in fear at what he saw. The player killer would ask Sean with a tight grip on the hilt of his blade that they were supposedly close to him, right? Hearing this, he did not understand why he thought he was close to him because he was talking nonsense. Slowly approaching him, Kane told him that the said blacklist, which GMS used to monitor among the so-called villains, and he had the most contacts with Mr. Anchovy, which greatly frightened the leader of the bandits. Immediately after this, he asked to wait, asking if he was really talking about the fact that he had complaints, and, confirming this, said that he thought this could also be called a contact. Interrupting him, the player killer explained that the creator of the game left it to him. Coming closer, he asked why he did this, and this was an opportunity to expose all the fraudulent users if he had followed his example, and so, why did he delete him? Recalling the events of the past from real life, Sean said that he even went to the company and begged on his knees, and asked if he was really there to dance around his dark past. Menacingly looking at his opponent, Kane gave a negative answer, noting that he had suspicions about the connection between him and Anchovy. Answering this accusation with a serious look, the leader of the bandits said that he thought he was making too many assumptions. Imagining the power stones in his head, Kane stated that as soon as the creator of the game was fired, they suddenly began to buy them, which no one needed. Then, standing in front of a huge crowd of bandits, he added that Sean was a fraudster who lived off of barter for the past 5 seasons, buying back items that he had never bought before, and also suddenly began stocking up on them as soon as Anchovy left the company. Continuing his reasoning, the player killer could imagine it, but the creator of the game told him that in the future this product will go up in price and suggested that because this bastard got something from him. Then Kane asked what it was and why he made a deal with a swindler, and the leader of the bandits was very scared and could not find the right words to explain. At the same time, the player killer continued to say that Anchovy needed an illegal deal that was made in secret, and he can provide everything that exists in this game without being caught. Closing his eyes, Sean tells his opponent that he really came up with a good story. A moment later, Kane grabbed him with his hand right by his clothes, which scared him greatly. With a look full of bloodlust, he told him not to look down on his feelings, because he spent years trying to get revenge on this man, and asked that he really thought that he no longer smelled this bastard. Still looking angrily at his opponent, the player killer asked him to tell him where he was. In response, the bandit chieftain only asked to let him go and completely stopped being afraid. Hearing this, Kane was very surprised. Suddenly taking out his blade, Sean repeated that he said to let him go. After that, the bandit chieftain struck his opponent, who managed to dodge at the last moment. Pointing the blades of his blade straight ahead, Sean asked him if he really seemed weak to him because he was behaving politely. Standing in a fighting stance, he said that a long time ago he took second place in a competition and had been running for many years. Surrounded by his subordinates, the bandit chieftain continued to say that he could not even be a professional player anymore because he killed ordinary people and stained himself. Holding a knife in his hand, Sean added that his expression irritated his eyes. With a look full of displeasure and disgust, holding the blade straight in front of him, he asked that they really thought that he would give up his place. With his head slightly tilted down, Kane stated that he was not in second place. Hearing this, the leader of the bandits was very surprised. Standing in place, the player killer declared that he won the competition in the first season, and his opponent said that he was talking nonsense and only took second place. Remembering all the culprits of his defeat, Kane explained that his opponent made a dirty move and deserved to be disqualified, but Anchovy did not pay attention to this. Greatly disappointed in his opponent after hearing this, Sean concluded that the reason he was looking for him was only because of the result of the competition. Immediately after this, the player killer held the blade straight in front of himself and asked him for the last time where he was. Then Kane added that if he did not answer him, he would kill them all, which greatly frightened the bandits' heads. In response to this, Sean called him crazy and asked him not to get too carried away with this because he was an outcast. Hearing this, the player killer with a crazy expression on his face declared that he liked it and the most interesting thing in this lousy game was killing others. Telling him to shut his mouth, the bandit leader gave the order to his subordinates to grab him, and they immediately rushed to the attack. Drawing the story continued in the same place. With a smile on his face, Sean laughed with all his might. Almost all of his limbs were cut off, and he called his opponent a crazy monster. All of his subordinates were killed by Kane and lay right on the ground. Looking at the bloody bodies of the bandits, their leader asked if he was a man at all. Standing right in front of his opponent with an emotionless look, Kane asked to tell him where Mr. Anchovy was. With a tight grip on his blade, he added that if he did not answer him, he would pursue him until he did, and he would continue to kill him until the last one. Coming closer, the player killer added that he would continue to kill him and would pursue him every time he changed his hideout, and he would kill him again. With a look full of madness, Kane declared that he could not do anything in this game, and he was such a person, which he knew. Looking arrogantly at his defeated opponent, he said that this was his last chance, and asked where he was. Immediately after this, the narrative of the story moves to the lobby of the VR world, where Chuck and Jesse were. Working with the game system, the boy thought that all his plans were going smoothly. Imagining a fire in the main city of the game, the creator understood that if destruction began, he would be treated with suspicion. Thinking back to his new persona, he noted that this was why he had to look like he had nothing to do with it. Continuing to figure out the system windows, the protagonist was going to change his address first, and as he told the others, they made it look like they moved to their hometown. Remembering the house they were in, Chuck added that they were managing everything remotely from there, and he would connect the characters in his main account. Imagining a full immersion capsule in his head, he mused that keeping a concurrency log would provide an alibi. The kid also reasoned that they were essentially faking logs running multiple applications, but Napalm was essentially faking logs running multiple applications and blocking access to remote execution, so he first needed to penetrate the security system because otherwise a window would appear denying access. Continuing to work with the system, the creator of the game thought that even if he knew all the weak points of the security protocols, it would take weeks. He grinned happily, noting that there was something, however. The protagonist then looked at Jesse, who was working with the system, and added that he had one of the best artificial intelligences in the world. Immediately after that, he told the gentleman that the job was done, which made him very happy. Preparing to press the start button of the game, Chuck asked if they should test and log into his protagonist's system after such a long time. Immediately after that, the system loaded his character into the game. The system notification window announced that the username was Anchovy, the profession was the Paladin of Ascension, the character level was 90, and the equipment level was 894. Immediately after this narration, the story was transferred to a mysterious forest swamp. The water in the reservoir began to stir. A white-horned monster covered in fur emerged from the swamp and asked who he was. It was the lord of the swamp, Jiguli, who asked with displeasure who he was, who awakened this body without any fear. Chuck suddenly moved and stabbed him with his blade, saying that he was the one. Immediately after that, the monster's corpse fell behind him. Turning to the side, the boy asked Jesse how much experience. Opening the system window, the artificial intelligence said that it seemed that one person received about 519 experience. Abruptly moving into Labo's body, the creator of the game thought that the difference in their levels was large, so there was no point in being together, and Jesse was very scared of the master. Looking at his subordinate, the protagonist asked why he was surprised and explained that since dual access is possible, it is easy to change characters and manipulate them, and he noted that this is true, but it is a little strange. Suddenly, his villain body froze in place. Chuck, who returned to the anchovy avatar, said that you can't manipulate them at the same time, and if one side moves, the other side remains motionless. Stretching his hand out in front of him, he added that if the activity logs of these two accounts were active at the same time, they would remain in the system, and no one would suspect him. After listening to his master, the artificial intelligence concluded that this was the perfect alibi. The boy, who had returned to Labo's body again, asked Jesse to book a ticket, and he again became scared, saying that he had asked him to stop changing characters all the time. After which, looking at his master, he asked why he needed a plane ticket. Once again changing the avatar to an anchovy, the creators of the game concluded that a 3-week round trip to Bali before the Season 6 update, while the artificial intelligence, not understanding anything because of such movements, once again asked to simply speak with one character. Then Jesse, having come to his senses a little, asked why Bali, and the protagonist, turning a little, said that there was a person he should meet on the trip. Disconnecting his night avatar from the simulation, Chuck declared that he had done enough testing. Returning to the villain's body, he suggested returning to intensive training, to which his assistant agreed. Suddenly, he received a notification from the system that Sean had written a message, surprising that he had logged in. After which the boy read that the leader of the bandits asked if he really wanted revenge. At this time, Sean continued the correspondence and received a message that this was not the case at all, explaining that Kane had appeared. After reading this, the creator of the game was extremely dumbfounded and asked again that this was really the same hunter, the killer of other players. Sitting at his computer in the game, his henchman answered that it was the same one, and the problem was that he had found out his ID. After receiving the information, the protagonist only grinned happily. Then he asked what he really told him about it, and the leader of the bandits, upset by this fact, expressed his pity, explaining that this guy made a mess in their hideout. Continuing to correspond, Sean read that Chuck wrote to him that, whatever the case, there was no need to worry about it, and it was enough that he told him about what happened. Remembering Kane, who came to his lair, the leader of the bandits said that his eyes were quite crazy. At the same time, the boy read messages from his friend that in any case he should be careful, and sighed heavily, thinking that Kane was still the same. Looking ahead with his menacing gaze, he supposed that it was even better this way. Immediately after this story, the story moves around to a mysterious forest, where the players gathered with their things, and someone said that he was pleased to meet them. It was a gray-haired sorcerer who claimed that he sold a lot of things for the show and had been playing for 3 seasons, so he asked them to believe in his advice. Hearing this, the other players were surprised at the max level person who would lead them, and this time they would arrive without problems, because they were so lucky. Jesse, who was watching everything from the side, asked the master standing next to him what these people were doing there, and he answered that most of them were merchants, which surprised his subordinate. Looking at the players' carts, Chuck explained that they made money by selling branded goods from each city to other cities, and did not put branded goods in their inventory, because they could only be loaded onto special equipment called carts. He also noted that, in addition, when they use them, they cannot use portals, so if they want to sell branded goods, they will have to drag the cart and move it themselves, and he imagined this in his head. While visualizing the attack on the cart with goods, the boy explained that in the fields between the cities there are monsters and bandits that only appear to raid, and even the field bosses do not move regularly. Moving alone is too risky, so players gather in groups. Looking at the sorcerer standing in the middle of the crowd, the creator of the game stated that usually the highest level players are in the lead, while he said that their goal is the city of Solitera. Looking at the wild forest ahead, he added that they have to go through it, and this is a foggy field, so it is easy to get lost. Looking at the merchants who followed him, the sorcerer explained that if they are separated from their companions, there is no need to panic and not move, and also send him a private message. While the knights listened attentively to his story, the gray-haired guy said the most important thing is that there are 5 field bosses in this forest. Pointing his finger straight ahead, he stated that these were pretty strong mobs, but if they didn't attack them first, they wouldn't attack back, so they should never be attacked. At the end of his story, the sorcerer asked if the others understood everything, and they all answered yes in unison. At the same time, the AI asked why they were following them, and its master just remained silent. Looking in his direction with an evil grin, the protagonist stated that this operation was to warm his nose without touching it. Looking at all the merchants who were right in front of them, he added that they would use them and kill the field bosses. Then the guys moved through the foggy forest. The knights led their horses, making their way through the trees. Suddenly, a group of merchants stopped, noticing something was wrong. Looking around, the guys did not understand what it was and assumed that perhaps an earthquake. Suddenly, one of them was very scared when he saw something in front of him. Right in front of him was a huge treant monster, and the merchant was telling everyone that it was a field boss. Coming out from behind them, the sorcerer explained that it was an ancient treant. Drawing the attention of the others, the leader of the group explained that it was a level 70 field boss, but it remained calm unless attacked, so there was nothing to worry about. Hearing this, the merchants sighed with relief because they knew that they definitely could not handle this thing. Then the sorcerer suggested that everyone else calmly pass by, and they obeyed him. The red-haired guy continued walking along with the rest of the squad. Suddenly, he noticed something strange behind him. Right behind him was the same field boss who seemed to be about to attack. Looking straight at him, one of the adventurers asked if he really wouldn't attack him. Answering his question, the squad leader gave a positive answer and with a smile on his face asked not to worry about it. At the same moment, a huge ant was preparing to strike the red-haired guy with his hand in the form of a branch. Having struck the ground with great force, the monster destroyed everything around and threw back the carts of the merchants, who were shouting that he was attacking them. Suddenly, a voice was heard telling everyone to get ready, and the sorcerer, with fear on his face, watching what was happening, said that he was sure that the ancient ant was an obedient boss, but he still forgot himself. Right behind their backs, at that very moment, Chuck appeared. He stood invisibly and watched everything that was happening. It is said that among his 2 professional skills, this is his favorite. After which the system notification window showed the characteristics and description of the first level shadow step. The sorcerer watched what was happening with fear on his face and simply remained silent. While the monster was trampling his subordinate merchants, he thought that he was sure that the century-old ant was a harmless boss. Having shot at it with his magic, causing damage, the leader of the party did not understand what they did wrong. Putting his hand straight in front of him, the sorcerer declared that there was no other way out and they would have to fight, ordering everyone to prepare for battle. Hearing this, the players with fear on their faces asked how it was possible to fight, and did not he have a plan for such situations. Suddenly, another adventurer told everyone to form into squads, and another noted that they did not have time. Seeing that the monster was preparing to strike with its hand, the leader of the party announced that he was advancing. Only one, as well as the field boss, managed to destroy several opponents at once. Watching everything that was happening, the sorcerer, gritting his teeth, was clearly dissatisfied and did not understand why he suddenly began to attack. Immediately after that, level 90 players entered the battle, saying that they would deal with him and asking to inflict enough damage, but not to be drawn into the attack zone. Then Free Wind, together with Nephrite, rushed straight towards the ancient ant. Having barely dodged her opponent's attack, the girl knight was preparing to strike back. Taking energy in her blade, she thought about which skill to use. Then, swinging her sword, Free Wind struck a double slash straight at her opponent. At this time, Nephrite concentrated energy in the artifact and used a thunder strike. Immediately after that, a thunderbolt fell on the field monster. Watching everything that was happening with great admiration, the knight noticed that these guys were tanking him for them. Inspired by what they saw, the adventurers gathered to pounce on the monster and kill it together. With a joyful smile on his face, Chuck watched everything from the side and noted that this was a wonderful atmosphere. Sitting in his place, he added that they all met recently, but it was quite nice to see how they fought together, which was very soulful, and Jesse, standing next to him, asked the gentleman with displeasure if it was okay that they were not helping. Continuing to smile, the boy explained that everything has its time and there is no need to worry. Looking at the great ant shrouded in lightning, he thought that with his attack level, he was more than sure that he would be able to shift the boss's attention to himself, but he would not have enough stamina to survive all of his attacks. Grinning maliciously, the creator of the game asked his friends to wait a little longer. Then, turning towards the AI, the protagonist told him to go to them and help, and he agreed, asking what the master would do, while he explained that he would join a little later. Hearing this, Jesse immediately rushed to the attack, saying that he was going, and Chuck silently followed him with his eyes. Looking at his subordinate, the boy noticed that he was in a hurry and asked to show how much he had grown. At this time, taking his staff, the AI ran to help the others. Raising his weapon above his head, he began to conjure and called the sanctuary. Having collected a sufficient amount of power, Jesse healed players within a 30-meter radius for 2% of their total health per second. At this moment, the wounded soldiers felt the magic of extraction on themselves. Examining themselves, they were surprised that their wounds were disappearing. At this time, the AI continued to use his healing spells and guardian angel auras. Having collected a huge amount of mana, he also used a healing wave. Looking at him, the adventurers expressed their gratitude and asked to heal someone else. Denially shaking his head, Jesse expressed his pity and explained that that was all. The protagonist, watching him from the side, noted that he was a good boy and stopped healing exactly when the boss could notice him. Immersing himself in his memories of artificial intelligence, he thought that first of all, a good healer is someone who perfectly senses timing and who does not use different abilities to save the entire squad. Stressing the importance of this role in the team, Chuck stated that healers should live as long as possible, because only in this way can they continue the battle. Using camouflage on himself, the boy wondered if he should gradually go out on stage. Approaching the battlefield, he used shadow post-op, surrounding himself with shadow. Now he switched to a lower level of stealth and increased his movement speed by 50%. At this time, the field boss was shouting loudly at his opponents. Hearing this, the warriors right next to him suddenly froze in fear. Noticing this, the sorcerer encouraged them, saying that they were one step away from finishing him off. The creator of the game was slowly approaching them, thinking that if he deals a lot of damage now, his contribution would be small, but there was another way. With a sly grin on his face, he noted that by dealing the final blow, he could get additional points. Immediately after that, the protagonist concentrated all his energy into the blade. Using all the accumulated mana, Chuck activated his cutting skills. The majestic ant immediately sensed something was wrong, after which he swung his hand straight at the boy to strike. Suddenly, the creator of the game began to disintegrate into small particles. A moment later, purple dust appeared right behind the monster. Right there, the protagonist gritted his teeth and was about to strike the shadow of the light beam. At that moment, the entire battlefield was illuminated with a bright white glow. Using the Dark Knight's exclusive skill, which teleported behind the enemy with a swirling weapon that dealt additional damage, the protagonist managed to destroy his enemy. Immediately after, the huge field monster fell straight to the ground. A moment later, the system notification window announced that the boss Century Treant had been defeated, and the adventurers who saw this did not understand how it happened so quickly. The system notification window that appeared right in front of Jesse gave him 3 dice. He immediately took them and was surprised that he had received so many at once. Suddenly, the player began to shout that they were starting to distribute the items from the boss. Standing right on the corpse of the monster, he said that there were also a couple of useful items, and if they needed them, they should roll the dice, to which the others agreed. At this time, the artificial intelligence approached its master and asked how many cubes he received. Answering his question, without being distracted from studying his rewards, Chuck stated that he had no idea. Yes, but it did not matter since the boss was level 70. His items were trash. Looking at the system notification window with 20 coins of the boss from the illusory forest, the boy noted that this was what had value and what he wanted to buy in the guild cost at least 100 coins. Then he looked at the players standing nearby who were dividing the rewards for the boss and thought that this meant that he needed to repeat the procedure 4 more times. The squad leader drank a healing potion after the battle. Wiping moisture from his mouth, he discontentedly cycled, while the merchants standing next to him talked that it was unexpected, but they still managed to kill him somehow. Lost in thought, the sorcerer recalled that it certainly hadn't seemed to him then that someone had attacked the boss first. Lost in his thoughts, he reasoned that it could have been one of them or a passing troll who decided to make fun of him, but now it was unlikely that it would be possible to find out. Immediately after that, the leader of the squad told everyone that they needed to continue their journey and that they should arrive at the campsite as quickly as possible. He also noted that if another boss attacked them in their condition, they would definitely not cope, which greatly shocked his subordinates. Hearing these words, the adventurers did not believe that such a thing was theoretically possible, and often crossed the forest, but never fought the boss more than once. Satisfying their curiosity, the sorcerer explained that caution would not hurt anyway. Diving into his consciousness, the leader of the squad thought that what they said was true, but it was almost impossible to accidentally meet a field boss twice. But after a while, the field boss, the queen bee, came out to meet them, with whom they would now have to fight. Looking at her with great fear, the players could not believe what was happening. Looking at his subordinates with fear on his face, the sorcerer said that he was many times stronger than the one they had met before and asked them to attack from a distance, and the rest obeyed him. Immediately after this, the wizards raised their staffs up and prepared to read the spell. Then they all attacked the queen bee with their magic together to force her to come down. Seeing this, the field base went into a rage and reflected all their attacks with a barrier of magic honeycombs. Noticing this, the squad leader concluded that the passy queen bee was immune to magic, and if possible, they should attack physically. Hearing this, the archers would knock their arrows and prepare to fire. A moment later, they would all launch their projectiles at the airborne boss. Suddenly, the queen bee would fly straight towards them, dodging every arrow. The archer on the ground would watch with fear on his face as the boss would fly straight towards him and knock his arrow. A moment later, it would hit the ground, sending several soldiers flying away. The field boss would hold the player's corpse in her hand with a smug grin on her face. The knight would be very scared at what she saw and would say that she was attacking. Immediately after that, the queen bee would push off the ground and rise back into the air at a great speed. Seeing this, the sorcerer said that he had told her to make her come down, and his subordinates did not understand how to do this, after which they discontentedly assumed that it was really necessary to riddle the wings with arrows, but the archers did not succeed in this. At this time, the field boss, being in the air, was thinking over a plan of action. Having collected a huge ball of flame, she was preparing to throw it directly at the people. Looking at her, the sorcerer was stunned that she was attacking with magic while in the air. When he realized that she was a serious opponent and even archers would not help here, so they had no chance, a fireball flew straight from the forest into the air. A moment later, it flew straight into the queen bee in the sky. Her wings immediately began to burn, and she herself screamed in terrible pain. Watching everything that was happening, standing below, the players did not understand what had happened. Suddenly, someone pointed to a nearby tower, saying that there was someone on it. There was a hearth there, fired by an unknown cannon. At the same time, it began to pour its energy into her, after which, a fireball was formed in her hell. Then the cannon fired, and its core, enveloped in flames, was directed straight towards the field boss. Having flown right next to the queen bee, the fire touched her wings and hurt a little. A moment later, she fell with a roar straight to the ground, which the merchants were extremely surprised by. The queen bee twitched from the damage received and the pain spreading through her body. Seeing that she was immobilized on the ground, the players immediately rushed to attack to finish her off. The squad leader, standing to the side, pointed his finger at her, telling his subordinates to kill her as soon as possible. Watching their battle with the boss from the side, the boy thought that he had designed the game so that everyone could use their surroundings. But these blockheads did not even guess about it, and what was stopping them from looking at the battlefield more openly, because Wings Online is quite simple and friendly in its structure. Suddenly, he remembered that he needed to deliver the final blow. At this time, due to the damage received from the constant blows of the enemies, the queen bee released her stinger. She raised it up and prepared to strike. Seeing it, the soldier was extremely surprised. At that moment, the sting pierced his body through and destroyed him. The field boss fought with her sting with her last strength against the enemies. Seeing this, the sorcerer said that they had caught the second phase and they needed to press on. Suddenly, the queen bee began to wave her stinger, preparing to strike. Releasing it, she surrounded a huge number of warriors, after which the field boss abruptly grabbed her stinger. With a deft movement of her hand, she managed to destroy a huge number of her opponents. Watching everything that was happening with a frightened look, the squad leader thought that they almost won, but they still did not have enough strength to defeat her. At that moment, the sting of the queen bee was approaching him directly. Noticing this, the sorcerer covered his face with his hands in fear. Suddenly, he saw that his opponent's grip fell next to him. Turning to the side, the squad leader noticed a bright glow from the skill. It was the creator of the game, who used the shadow of a beam of light on the field boss, causing colossal damage. Watching all this, the sorcerer was extremely dumbfounded and simply remained silent. Having completed his blow, the protagonist landed on the ground nearby. Putting his blade straight in front of him, he declared with a smile on his face that he had completed the task of delivering the final blow. Then a question was heard addressing the wizard. The merchants, exhausted by the constant battles, asked if this was really it and that they would not encounter another boss. After such a question, the squad leader thought that this was definitely not a coincidence, and that an encounter with one field boss was possible, but with two was unlikely. Then he remembered the man who always dealt the final blows to the monsters. Gritting his teeth in anger, the sorcerer realized that this was clearly his doing. At that moment, the sounds of laughter came from the forest. Sitting on a tree branch, the protagonist laughed, because he could not believe that he had earned as many as 30 coins for this. With a joyful grin on his face, he wondered who would be next. Suddenly, Chuck looked up, very surprised. He was surprised by what he saw. Right above his head was a huge white bird, which was screaming loudly. While the boy was looking at it, the system notification window announced that it was the master of the forest, a hippogriff with an unknown level. Still in the same forest, breathing heavily, hiding behind the trees. Holding his wounded hand, he, gritting his teeth, said that he barely managed to escape and was lucky to run into this bastard that crawls out of his den once a month. Looking at the hippogriff flying in the sky, the boy noted that just a little more and he would have torn him to shreds. Suddenly, some terrible thought came to his head. Continuing to look at the majestic bird, the creator of the game thought that he did not fly to the merchants by chance. At this time, the players, who had gone through several battles with bosses, were lying on the ground, resting after them. Jesse, who was next to them, helped them recover using healing magic. Having finished his job, the artificial intelligence wiped the sweat from his forehead. The soldier sitting next to him thanked the killer, and it must be hard when there is no one to help. With a joyful smile on his face, Jesse replied that it was okay because his job was to heal people. Suddenly, an unknown person interrupted their conversation, asking for forgiveness for this. Holding an unknown blue potion in his hands, he said that it was little that they could repay him with and asked to accept this gift as gratitude. Hearing this, the artificial intelligence waved his hands, saying that he could not take it because he was only doing his job. Looking at the especially mana restoration potion, which instantly restored all of it, he also asked that, and besides, was this gift too valuable? Answering his question with a smile on his face, the warrior explained that it was practically useless to them and that he was lucky to get it in yesterday's raid, so he had nothing to worry about. After hearing this, Jesse did not even know what to answer. Then he looked at the impenetrable forest that was right in front of him. With a joyful smile on his face, the artificial intelligence took the gift because he really did a great job as a healer and, remembering his master, wondered if he would be praised. Suddenly, Jesse realized that he had disappeared again and was almost fighting a boss, not giving them time to regroup. Then he decided to send him a message and asked where his master was, and he was typing a response. After that, the artificial intelligence saw a huge number of incomprehensible symbols on the screen and assumed that some kind of bug had occurred. Suddenly, an unknown cry of surprise was heard, and Jesse immediately turned to the side. Right in front of him stood the master of the illusory forest, a hippogriff, and the squad commander told everyone to get ready. Seeing a huge monster right in front of him, the healer was very stunned. Covering it with his body, the soldier asked him to wake up. Looking at Jesse, he noted that they would never cope with him. Then the player told him to run faster when suddenly the hippogriff killed him with his foot. The AI was lucky to survive, falling right between the monster's claws. A moment later, the master of the illusory forest was about to strike again with his paw, and Jesse could not believe what was happening. Then the huge bird finally did what he had planned. At the last moment, several warriors managed to block his blow, put their backs out, and they screamed loudly in pain, telling the AI to save itself right now. The latter, in turn, looked at the dying soldiers with great fear on his face and gratitude. At the same moment, Free Wind was about to enter the battle, heading straight towards the monster. Sharply turning to the side, she distracted the sorcerer. Noticing her sign, the squad commander immediately understood the hint. After that, he took out a guitar and began to play the melody of life on it, giving a buff with a positive effect, increasing the speed of movement and attack by 30%. Having received such a boost, the girl knight rushed forward at great speed. Jumping off the ground, she swung her blades to strike. A moment later, Free Wind plunged her sword straight into the monster's body. Noticing this, the other soldiers were about to attack. Without thinking twice, they approached their opponent and struck. The archers who were nearby also began to pull their bowstrings. A moment later, they released their arrows to attack. A huge number of projectiles flew straight at the hippogriff, causing great damage. Immediately after this, the huge bird became very angry. Raising its head up, it began to scream loudly and use magic. Watching as the master of the illusory forest enveloped itself in a huge whirlwind, the soldiers told everyone to step back, but then realized that it was too late. Then the tornado began to pull the players inside. One after another, they flew towards the whirlwind at great speed. The hippogriff, standing still, continued to use magic, causing several tornadoes around itself. After the impact of these whirlwinds, the exhausted players lay on the ground and could not move. There were also a huge number of corpses lying next to them. At this time, Jesse tried to use his skills to help. With his last strength, he tried to resurrect the dead, but the system notification window notified that his mana was completely depleted. Sighing heavily, the artificial intelligence said that it could not do anymore. Gritting his teeth in dissatisfaction, he asked his master for forgiveness. Suddenly, he put his hand on his shoulder and asked why exactly, which surprised him greatly. Calling him a fool, Chuck said that he fought well. When Jesse saw his master, he immediately burst into tears of happiness. With a sly grin on his face, the boy told his subordinate that he did a very good job. At this time, the remaining forces of merchants moved forward. Looking at the rest of the soldiers, he shouted that they must do this and kill this creature. Turning back, he asked the fillers to take care of the wounded. They obeyed him. Raising their hands up, the healers immediately used the resurrection skill. Immediately after that, bright blue rays fell from the sky on the warriors. An unknown blue glow also caught up with the sorcerer. Heading along with the rest of the knights towards the hippogriff, someone declared that he was opening a hunt for him. Watching everything that was happening from the side, the artificial intelligence did not understand when they arrived. Satisfying his curiosity, the creator of the game explained that these were other merchants who left an hour later than them, and Jesse could not believe that his master had read this too, while he played along with him, saying that it was so. At this time, on the battlefield, the squad commander began to play a melody on the guitar. A moment later, green vines enveloped the protagonist's legs. Noticing this, the artificial intelligence asked his master to be careful. A moment later, Chuck lost his balance. The sorcerer used a vine summoning that would envelop the selected target and lift the boy upside down. After which he would ask if it was really him, and the game creator looked at him in confusion. The squad leader, along with Free Wind and Jade, stood right in front of him and asked if it was really him who had set the bosses on them and dealt the final blow. At that moment, Jesse tried to stand up for his master, saying that they had misunderstood, but someone suddenly stopped him. Putting his hand on his shoulder, the soldier told the healer not to interfere because he didn't know why he was in the same squad. After which, looking at the protagonist suspended by the vine, he added that he had definitely crossed the line. Then, with great anger, pointing his finger at him, the squad leader asked if it was really fun for him to cause suffering to others. Answering his question, with an innocent smile on his face, the protagonist gave a positive answer, noting that even very much. Hearing such an answer from his master, the artificial intelligence did not understand what he was doing at all. One closed one eye and noted that in front of them was a crazy troll, and 3 replied that he had the mark of the inglorious and offered to ask his guards let him rot in prison where he might come to his senses. The team became wary in response to the question of the maximum level and that the level of items should also be adjusted. Chuck hangs upside down and asks that didn't they come into this game to enjoy an exciting adventure in order to escape from reality for a while. He smiles and continues that in their opinion the guys who joined them a little later through the Vimagoda went to the boss and without blood and tears in the online game, and notes that this is not true. Chuck continues that this is fun because each raid is so unique that it is simply impossible to pass by. A group of people are hunting a beaked beast. The people listen half-heartedly as he insists that the thrill they feel when facing a strong boss and the sense of accomplishment from successfully completing a raid that turned out to be impossible is the camaraderie with the players who went through hell with him. The red-haired one says that it only reminded him of the fun of the game that is impossible to forget. The bird-like one prepares to attack. The man with the stick points at him and says that they almost finished him off and gives the command to keep up the pace. 3 turns to the bard, since they should join in 2. The bard clicks his tongue in displeasure. He turns to the red-haired one, saying that he justifies his actions with nonsense and scolds him. As his legs are freed from the vines, he adds that since the death of the boss is more important, he will free him. The guy falls head first, while he continues that he should consider himself lucky. He frowns and hints that he admits that he experienced pleasure for the first time in a long time. Jesse tries to cure him in fear. The boss was killed by a group of players. Someone gives the command to sort out the loot, and if they see that you are suitable, they must roll a dice. The system notifies that users have received 3 dice as a contribution. Chuck looks at them and thinks that there are only 3 of them and understands that it does not matter because this is the boss who appeared before the start of the season, therefore useful items can be expected from him. The system notifies that he will receive a hippogriff heart, the scale shows how much time is left and the question whether he wants to roll a dice to secure the reward. The guy exclaims with delight that he would rather choke. He looks at the stone and understands that this is the reason why he saved up coins by killing bosses, and it was to buy a hippogriff heart. The guy with crazy eyes throws the dice because he planned to buy it since the chance of this item falling out is extremely low. He smiles and throws them up and asks if he was blessed. The dice slowly fall down. 1 die lands on the number 6, to which the guy says that today the goddess of fortune is clearly on his side. The second die lands on the number 1. The system notifies what results he has on the rolls, specifically free wind, elbow and a piece of cake, for the points of 9, 7 and 5 respectively. Chuck looks ahead with displeasure and asks if it will not land on the number 1 a second time. The number 1 lands again. The message window says that he got 8 points in total from the throw. The guy grabs his head and screams with displeasure. Jesse tries to click on him. The girl happily replies that she must have made a significant contribution. The guy looks at her in bewilderment. Chuck is kneeling and gives her the command to give them to her right now. Someone is carrying carts on a horse. The man is holding a hippogriff artifact in his hands, to which someone asks what it is needed for. The guy looks at him madly and says that it is needed in order to level up to level 70 in the blink of an eye. Jesse looks stunned and asks again about level 70. Against the backdrop of the sunset, someone says that they have arrived, someone else says that he sees the city and is happy that they have finally arrived, and another asks why it is so beautiful today if he gets to see it almost every day, while someone thanks everyone for their help. Jesse happily sheds a tear because she understands what Solitera is like and that it is very beautiful. The building stands against the backdrop of the sunset and someone continues that not without incident, but they have reached their destination. The bard smiles and thanks them for everything, because this is where their paths diverge and if fate allows, they will meet again. People thank him for the fact that they got there well and say goodbye. Someone wishes him a pleasant game and that they will see each other again while running through the gate. Jessie runs forward asking herself what Solitera is and that she can't wait to find out. Chuck grabs her by the collar and asks her to stop. The red-haired man declares that they cannot get there, to which she asks why. Against the background of the guards, he asks if she forgot that they are inglorious. If they go there, the guards will grab them and throw them in prison. The girl points there and asks if there are any other ways to get to this beautiful city. Chuck smiles and says that there are no such ways while he is inglorious. He will only be welcome in the underground city. The guy takes her away, while she asks him to stop and let her at least mark him in the portal. The red-haired man carries her too, saying that there will be no holiday. The plot reports that they went to a pub 3 kilometers from this place. The bald man is drinking something from a mug. He slams it on the table so that it almost falls apart. He asks what kind of shitty taste this beer has and whether he poured him beer or urine. The bearded man gets nervous and says that if he is not satisfied with the beer, why doesn't he try the local rum? Because his rum is the best in the area. The bald man grabs him by the collar and threatens the poor bartender, saying that he has already lost his appetite and asks how he is going to compensate for this. Someone notes that it is very noisy here. The fair-haired man asks discontentedly who is this loud-mouthed person who is not letting him sleep. The man in the panda suit says grizzly. Someone hangs upside down, beaten, and asks for help, while the second asks what the hell is going on here. Someone replies that this loud-mouthed person turned out to be inglorious, while he says that he was wrong, and he continues that he is a loser, that the only thing he can do is pester weak NPCs. The man in the suit turned around discontentedly and replies that God be with him, because now something else is more important, because he found a notorious inglorious person, and the second asks how much of a notorious person he is. He smiles and replies that he has more than 20,000 reputation, and he immediately accepted the request. The man with yellow hair twirls his hair on his finger and wonders why so little, because he doesn't even have enough food for 2 weeks with the reward, and continues that it will take 2 weeks to track him down and asks if it's worth it. The guy in the kigurumi frowns and insists that we won't need to track him either because he's not far from Solitera at the moment, and the beauty of it all is that he's level 50. He also clarifies that there are 2 of them and not 1. Jessie asks if they're going to the dungeon again, to which he receives a positive answer. The system reports that the dungeon boss test is starting, called the Temple of the Forgotten Guardian. The difficulty will be high. The recommended level is estimated at 75th. There are large gates in front of the heroes. Chuck looks displeased while Jessie asks what a dungeon test is, to which he receives the answer that in a dungeon in which you only need to kill the boss and nothing more. And as soon as the user enters, the boss appears, and after killing him, everything ends. The guy closes his eyes and continues that he tried to create a game of specific dungeons so that players would not get bored, and this creation is one of them, but makes a remark that unfortunately such an innovation quickly became boring because soon everyone forgot about it. He looks at the statue with a glowing sword and continues that, however, there is no better place for them, to which the girl asks if the statue is the boss of the dungeon, to which he receives a positive answer. Chuck stands nearby and says that if the player goes beyond the circle line, the boss will wake up and the game will begin, to which he receives a question whether they can defeat him together because after all, the recommended level for this dungeon is 75. The statue lights up while he continues that maybe they could not defeat him before. He holds out the artifact with the words that everything will go smoothly with him. The system notifies him that this is the heart of a hippogriff. It is a catalyst that increases the effect of potions by 1 whole and 2/10 of a wound, and the remaining amount of use is 100, to which the girl clarifies what a catalyst is. The guy smiles and says that, simply put, it can be applied to everything that the user can touch. In this case, it can enhance 100 of any potions, and her attention was probably drawn to the figure of an increase of 1 whole and 2/10 times, which in itself does not play an important role. But he clarifies that many essentially lose sight of the fact that it can also increase the rank of a potion. He looks at the heart of a hippogriff and says that a higher rank potion than usual will not help much against a boss monster. But if the user enhances them with the heart of a hippogriff, the potion with a normal debuff is transformed into a debuff of a higher rank, which in turn can already work against bosses. The system notifies that he used the heart of a hippogriff and created an improved poisonous potion of the Basilisk. The guy is quite happy holding the work in his hands. He hands it to the girl, saying that he has created an improved poison potion, and asks what she thinks will happen if he throws it at the boss while outside the circle, to which she wonders if he will not avoid damage while the player is outside the circle. He looks at the statues and notes that she is right, because this big guy will not do anything while the player is outside the circle, but the player will not be able to inflict damage until he enters the circle. He throws the potion and says that only if the player does not use a trick. The bottle breaks. Chuck draws her attention to the fact that he did not even move, and if you use the script vulnerability correctly, you can do much more. The guy sits down on the floor contentedly and continues that all they can do is sit back and wait for the experience points to come to them, and asks if she agrees that this is cool. Jessie asks him again, perplexed, because he is using game bugs. He smirks and asks her to keep her fingers crossed. She watches in admiration while he says that there is a chance that this guy might drop something legendary, to which she asks again about the legendary item. The girl holds onto his cloak and asks him to come back and try again because this time she is sure that something will drop, to which he asks with displeasure if she thinks that the legendary that hasn't dropped for 10 hours will only drop if she wants it. Chuck bares his teeth and continues that since they are already level 70, they will come here again but as soon as they change their class, to which she insists on coming back for the legendary weapon. He replies with displeasure that it is not his fault that anything is being hooked. They see two people ahead. The yellow-haired girl smirks and notes that she found them. Travis asks what the two inglorious ones lost here. I note that it does not matter to him because he just had nothing to do and they ask if they can be considered a gift from above. Chuck turns to the girl. The guy grabs her hand and says that she better not leave him. Travis grins and says that he will play tag with them. Stella smiles and asks him to stop because it will not be fun if it ends too quickly. Cereals sway in the wind, and Jesse asks why they did not like them, to which he asks again and she continues that when he was level 25 he would easily defeat two players who were superior to him. The guy looks warily and replies that these two are bounty hunters. They earn their living by catching inglorious players and the difference between all the idiots and the name is too significant, and not only that they are at the maximum level where after the 4th class change a new system opens called a trait, to which the girl clarifies what it is. Against the background of icons with abilities, he says that in a nutshell, the user can enhance 3 traits of his character such as attack, strength, and utility, and specifically 1 point for every 10 levels. They can be distributed between all traits or concentrated on one. The guy put the sword behind his head and continues that, therefore, the difference between level 90 and below will be very different, to which she clarifies what he means. Chuck says that she thought correctly and clicks on Akasa from the friends list because at the moment their chances of winning are 0. The guy in the chat communicates with Akasa saying that he did not want to resort to this strategy until the last minute, to which Jesse asks what strategy exactly they are talking about. The red-haired guy smiles and explains that the name of this strategy is Garbage Collects Garbage. Travis asks if she is sure that they went here, to which she says that there are not many places nearby where they could hide. The girl angrily listens to reasoning about how much she studied everything. Travis dodges the spear at the last moment. Chuck in horror puts his sword in front of him, to which the system notifies him that the block was successful. The guy breaks with his toes. The red-haired guy is stunned thinking that such serious damage was done even when he successfully blocked the blow and realizes that she probably pumped up the maximum attack level. His thoughts are interrupted by Travis piercing his solar plexus. The man in the kigurumi throws him away angrily while Jesse worries. The girl holds out her hand and uses a healing touch. Stella asks how many times she needs to repeat it. She swings her sword, saying that he should get rid of the healer first. The guy grins and the system inquires about the ability Shadow from a beam of light. This is an exclusive skill of the Dark Knight. He teleports him behind the enemy with a swirling weapon that deals additional damage. Stella notices such a fast movement. The girl hits her opponent with all her anger. Jesse looks in horror. Tella turned away. The yellow-haired girl looks to the side and asks what just happened. Travis thinks that he sees such a skill for the first time. The white-haired girl runs to Chuck with horror in her eyes. The guy in the kigurumi attacks and asks where she is going. The guy throws the girl back. Stella goes to them and says that he has met enough people with hidden classes. Chuck grins and listens. The girl swings, saying that she tensed up for the first time when he attacked. She strikes him right in the chest. Chuck cries out in pain as his health indicator approaches 0. Stella presses her weapon and asks who he is. Someone gives her a rude command to take her hands off him, to which she looks at him in bewilderment. Chuck grins and notes that he is in time. The brunette looks displeased while he calls him by name. The red-haired man notes that now the most interesting part begins. Kane holds his sword and says that you shouldn't touch someone else's thing. He looks at her with crazy eyes and notes that otherwise you can end up without a hand. The yellow-haired girl grins and asks if they are friends and notes that she still doesn't care whether she lets him go or not since he is not that valuable. But that's another matter. Stella looks madly at the new victim because she is interested in bigger prey. She looks at the brunette and realizes that this is a bounty hunter named Kane. The guy asks her if they know each other. Travis mockingly asks how a fellow worker cannot know another hunter and he thanks the Lord for such a gift that he almost cries. He continues that it is quite rare to meet players with more than 1 million in bad reputation. Kane discontentedly replies that since they know him, they need to realize that the two of them cannot cope with him. Both unanimously note his wrongness because they will be the first to kill a monster among monsters. The brunette calmly stands and suggests that they see what happens in the end, because there is nothing more pleasant than first killing one and seeing the expression of despair on the face of the other. The man in the kigurumi runs at him with a fist and declares that he is bluffing. The guy puts his shoulder under the blow. Stella prepares to attack from above. Kane calmly stops her sword with his bare hands. Travis does not waste time and also strikes. The brunette blocks all the blows. The man and the Kigurumi achieve the point that the guy flew off. The guy's body hits the ground several times. He looks up at the sky and is perplexed. He looks down at them and asks if they are ordinary losers. Both run at him and give him a positive answer. Kane jumps up and continues that the most fun in this shitty game is killing players. Jesse heals Chuck and asks if he knows that guy, to which he receives in response that they do not know each other personally, but that he has long been looking for a meeting with him and asked Akaz to share his location with him. The girl looks at the explosion and asks if he can definitely handle 2 players, to which Chuck replies that she should watch and listen because she will have something to learn from him. Kane fights with 2, while he continues that it is rare when there is an opportunity to watch a fight between high-level players. The brunette is exhausted. He looks at the bodies of his opponents. Stella discontentedly says that the rumors that he is damn strong were not wrong and adds that she thinks that he did not take second place in the competition for nothing. Travis also asks discontentedly why he kills players if he is so strong, because wouldn't it be better to take up martial arts again and strive for something higher? Kane is perplexed by his offer about martial arts and continues that it would be possible if not for one asshole who calls himself Albo, but immediately denies it. The brunette in horror realizes that someone pierced him in the back. Chuck looks madly and notes that they have not seen each other for a long time, while the system notifies him that he is using the ability Shadow Tread level 1, and it consists in the fact that the user, surrounding himself with a shadow, goes into a lower level of stealth, increasing his movement speed by 50%. Kane in horror declares that he is a bastard. The guy screams in pain, while his opponent uses a shadow cut. Stella is perplexed and asks what is going on there. Travis gets up and offers her to go back to the village first, to which the girl agrees. Chuck looks up contentedly and says that holy shit, because he killed him. The guy's face is cut in 2. Kane, with all his anger, cuts the guy in half. The brunette angrily turns around and says that he should watch his opponent's health more closely, because it is almost at 0, but he is not dead. Jesse calls out to his master. The brunette drinks the potion and replenishes his health. He turns to the healer. The guy looks at the cut Chuck and asks to resurrect him, because one death is not enough for him because he wants to see another. The blonde is perplexed. Someone shouts across the field for him to stop, wait and listen to him. Kane says that if he says anything about the finale of the first season, he is not going to listen to him. The red-haired man looks displeased and remains silent. He asks him to just listen and tells him that during the martial arts competition of the first season of individual sparring, specifically the final between him and Aaron where he lost by a large margin and as the winner who took first place all the honor and glory went to him. He looks at him and asks if it is true that he was forgotten as the loser. The brunette looks at him and screams that it is all because of him, because he knew. He remembers his sparring and clarifies that he knew that his opponent cheated in the final. Kane grins and continues that he received absolutely impossible damage then and the game did not count because of it. He is taken away by the judges while he says that his words were simply ignored. He recalls the messages and tells that he was even ridiculed and quotes the question whether anyone saw how he protested in the game yesterday, to which another writes that the dude simply could not come to terms with defeat and is indignant, another that Kane is a loser, and the fourth that he agrees with them, because there is a significant difference between his opponent's skills and his skills, but he cannot admit it, and therefore he is offended by everyone. And the penultimate adds a question that the guy took second place and why the hell is he still unhappy? The last one in turn, that the world remembers only winners, that's why he is angry. Kane thinks that they criticized him as if he was an offended person who is unable to admit his own defeat. He turns to Chuck with the words that he was the lead developer at that time and eventually the director who oversaw those very martial arts competitions. The guy trembles and asks him to declare that his opponent cheated and so that he could defend his honor. The brunette screams that he wouldn't have ended up like this if it weren't for his actions. The redhead thinks about it and asks if that's the only reason he decided to kill players. Kane confirms this information, because he wants to destroy this garbage game and for this he started killing every player he meets. Chuck madly asks if he's ready to play with him in that case. Kane asks again, perplexed, what they're going to play. Chuck says that they'll fight in a duel. The red-haired man says that his opponent will win, and he will go public under a different nickname and tell everyone what really happened in the first season of martial arts. The brunette asks if he really agrees to this. Chuck says that he has a condition, namely if he wins, then he must become his subordinate. Kane frowns and asks if they will start now, because he agrees to his conditions. The red-haired man, perplexed, asks him to stop because he agrees to sparring when he becomes level 90 in the game because now he will be of no use. Chuck smirks and asks if he wants to fight on equal terms, to which the brunette thinks about it. The red-haired man asks why he thought about it, because all that is required of him is to wait and then defeat him, and this is nothing, and from him in turn the disclosure of the truth in the final round. Kane frowns while he insists that he agree. The brunette thinks that even if he reaches his 90th level, he does not think that he will allow himself to give in to him, and the more he hesitates. He looks at the smiling Chuck and thinks that there is something in this confident look of his and asks himself what he has in mind. Kane looks displeasedly at the system notification that Albo sent him a friend request. The red-haired man asks to add him, and he will immediately inform him when he reaches his 90th level. The brunette trembles and reluctantly presses the button to accept the request with the thought that he will immediately delete it when the bet is over. Chuck suggests in this case to disperse until those hunters for them return, because he and Jesse will not survive a second skirmish with them. The system notifies him that he is creating a portal. The brunette enters the passage in space with the words that they will see him again. The red-haired man displeasedly notes that he incorrectly called his current nickname. Jesse, against the background of ears of corn, asks if this is true. Chuck asks again what exactly, to which she replies that his words that his opponent cheated in that sparring. Both walk along the field, while the guy asks him to listen and asks what in her opinion should be paid special attention to when controlling the game, to which she does not understand and asks the correct answer. The red-haired one looks at the sunset with displeasure and talks about justice, because each of the players should be on equal terms with everyone else and in his understanding. Each of them is rewarded for hard work in their own way while playing Wings Online. He remembers how he controlled the game and continues that because of this, he abandoned the buy and win system and plunged headlong into class balancing. Chuck thinks that if it does not exist in the world, then it is worth creating it in the game, because he believed that by investing enough effort and time in the game, then over time everything should pay off, and he was so obsessed with this thought that he was ready to make sacrifices. The guy remembers that tournament and states that it was just an example of a place in which people use skills and experience only for battle. The red-haired man also looks at the sunset and continues that it can be said that he even succeeded in this, to which she asks if what Kane said is true. Chuck replies that he is only partly right, because they themselves have not fully understood the current situation. Jesse is perplexed by the plural of the story. The guy grins and says that it is not easy to manage the game and he really tried to do his best. His cloak flutters in the wind as he continues that even the most persistent cannot stand it and disappear into oblivion. Jesse sadly looks at the back of his head. The red-haired man stretches his hands out of the portal and says that even so, he is to blame for what happened to Kane and he bears full responsibility for it. He turns to the girl and says that since they have crossed the 70th level, it is time for their third qualification, to which she confirms this fact. Chuck notes with displeasure that his problem is that he needed 50,000 to retrain, but Kane came and killed him and thereby dropped his reputation by exactly half, while he himself thinks that the opposite should have happened. Jesse asks what he is hinting at, to which he asks her again. Chuck madly replies that he wants to ask her friends for help in this matter. Jesse asks what the hell while someone screams. The red-haired man stands next to the corpses and says that this is great because they restored his reputation. Jesse goes into the portal and waves his hand while he says goodbye to her. The system notifies about the creation of the portal. The guy looks at her in bewilderment. The red-haired man noticed a bracelet on his wrist and realizes what it is. He presses the bracelet in the armor with the thought that somewhere it was said that he can use it after reaching his 70th level. Chuck stands in armor against the background of the game Matrix. He appears against the background of palm trees. The red-haired man sees something in front of him. A long-haired girl is standing in front of him. She turns around and asks if her name is Gaia. Against this guy, she asks if he remembers that when he first started creating his game, he made such a fuss about it and he could have left everything to her, but insisted that he would personally manage everything. The waves tide the shore, and the girl continues that he wanted to be behind everything that happened with the game. She remembers that all this lasted until he eventually created a giant tsunami and he had to clean up after it. Chuck looks ahead with displeasure. The guy asks again why she suddenly started talking about this topic because he does not have much time to indulge in old memories. Gaia looks at him and replies that creating something is a truly significant undertaking and now she can understand his desire for this. Chuck shows her the glove and asks what it is for him and clarifies if it is so that he can talk to her through it. The girl smirks and continues that this is not its only use. The red-haired man looks at the glove and the system notifies about the scanner activation and that he can now see the object status. Chuck is surprised to think that in this game you can't view other players' statistics unless they share them themselves. Chuck scans a level 90th user of the Night Guard class who has an attack of 3019, defense of 5125, exactly 312, critical damage of 158, his attack speed of 52, physical defense of 205 and magical defense of 127. Also the value of the full health level equal to 19,600 and the value of mana equal to 1,580. While he thinks that everything is not just like that, because each number in the characteristic and other things is one of the important elements of information in the game. Chuck is stunned by what he sees, because in his understanding this contradicts the rules of the game. Gaia says that she has something else, that she has a particularly important quest for him. While the system notifies about it, its name is the Prayer of the Goddess, and the rank is legendary. He needs to reach the 100th level. The girl goes to him with an explanation that the quest consists of several stages. For each completed stage he will be given a special reward until he finishes it completely, to which he asks her to wait. The guy looks and answers that in the system the highest difficulty of the quest is epic, but in what she gave out there is a characteristic legendary and he does not remember adding such. He listens in bewilderment about the fact that she created such a difficulty of quests. She madly repeats what she said, that she herself created it of her own free will. Chuck swallows and thinks that the world's artificial intelligence interfered with the gameplay and does not understand how this happened without human permission. The red-haired man continues in horror that the artificial intelligence is pretending that there is nothing wrong with this and realizes that something is wrong. Gaia smiles and says that she will say goodbye to him on this and adds that they are destined to meet again. The guy flies into the game matrix asking her to stop. He finds himself in a forest area and says that he has several questions for her. Chuck looks heartlessly into the portal. The red-haired man grins in horror and asks himself what she plans to do. The system sends him a message. The game says that it welcomes adventurers in the person of the game director. He continues that today he has good news for them. The director tosses coins and continues that it has happened and the game is finally becoming free for users. The system asks what free access is and explains that the game is becoming absolutely free and available to everyone. The director spreads his hands saying that he hopes that now they will be able to enjoy the game to the fullest with their friends and thanks them for continuing to play the game, and in the future he promises to continue to delight them with great content and thanks everyone again. Notification that the game is becoming free. The system pops up dialog boxes about this saying that user 5 thinks there were rumors that the game would be bad and it was because it remained an irreplaceable virtual reality that can be played normally. While user number 44 says that he will be honest because he does not understand why everyone is complaining about the game. If it were updated to free to play, then more people would be interested in it and asks what their problem is. Below user 214 asks why they are defending them if the items will be much more expensive than if they just left a subscription to the game and asks if it could be a matter of paid comments. To which user number 6033 asks if they think these greedy idiots will leave them normal prices and clarifies if they are not learning from their past mistakes. Also that user 524 suggests to see what happens next and whether they can just play something else and asks if there is anything they should play, and user 912 says that this game will be for him forever. Jesse looks sadly at the monitor and says that they finally updated the purchase conditions even after the master's protest. The girl thinks that he pretended not to care about the current situation, but in fact his conscience is eating him up from the inside. Chuck turns around and says that this is great and asks her to be faster, because if they take the free 25% boost experience and if they buy a paid 25% boost experience, they will receive a 50% boost for the next 2 weeks. The girl is perplexed until he says that they need to increase their levels as much as possible in the shortest possible time, to which she thinks that he suffered because of them. The guy pokes at the screen saying that this is not all and asks to look at all these cool items, until she asks him to control himself. The system notifies him about uncontrolled purchases. A window also pops up about a probationary contract. It removes the restriction on equipping 10 items, and its duration is 30 days, while he thinks that the contract allows you to use items 9 levels higher than them. They also notify him that he has an Oblivion contract. He has an unlimited number of stat resets also for 30 days, which he comments on how now thanks to this Oblivion contract they can redistribute their stats whenever they want. He continues that they can also optimize their stats during hunting or sparring with another player. The system shows that he can pump up stats from strength equal to 6 units, agility equal to 8, endurance equal to 15, intelligence equal to 58, and mana equal to 24, because he has free 36 points to pump up the above stats. Chuck smirks and says that he still has a cherry on top. He says that about the contract for immunity, about which the system says that it is available only to popular users and allows you to avoid fines for the duration of the contract and is valid only 1 week per month, with a remark that it is updated every first day of the month and that thanks to this contract. He smiles and says that they will finally be able to complete the most important quest of this game, to which the girl asks again what it is about. The guy says that this is a quest that follows immediately after the main story. This is the most effective way to raise your level and this quest is mandatory, but they cannot start it since they are notorious players and thinks that they can raise their level much faster than he thought. The system notifies about the quest summoning a legendary class goddess, for which he needs to reach level 100. The guy smiles and asks Gaia about her goal, but they will play together. He turns to the girl and calls them together to go to the kingdom of White Snow. He thinks about the capital of White Snow, because it is a prosperous capital and the largest in the game, as well as a fortress surrounded by walls. The houses of NPCs and players are located in a circle, and in the inner circle is the royal palace and the temple of the clergy. Something is burning, while the man asks the children where they are. The man with the lantern asks if they are here and that they can go out. He walks on the tiles. The man turns around indifferently. The girl asks what she is looking for. There are potions on the table. Chuck walks through the city while the blonde is happy. She looks around enthusiastically and says that she has never seen so many people at once. Jesse asks if this is a market, to which he receives in response that there are many shops and anyone can bargain there with other players, and he thinks that such a place can be called a market. The guy smiles because he is glad that they are finally there, and he is not surprised that she is so carried away by everything. Jessie bumps into someone. She looks warily. In front of her is a man in armor and she asks if it is a guard. The man in armor addresses her. Jessie responds in horror while he asks if she is a traveler. The knight smiles sweetly because he finally found what he needs. The blonde is perplexed. Chuck asks her not to be afraid because they are just ordinary players, and he will give them the first quest, which is connected with the main one, while he says that several city kids recently escaped into the sewers but have not returned from there yet. The NPC thinks about the sewers and continues that they have too few people to start a search operation. The knight asks if they will go to save them. The system notifies that the quest has a scenario because great adventures begin small, and the current goal is to enter the sewer room. Jesse smiles and gives a positive answer, saying that he can rely on them. Something disgusting flows out of the pipe while someone denies what is happening. Against the background of a boot in a puddle, someone asks what he should do. Someone asks Grandma what happened. Jessie asks if they can help her with anything. Against the background of a boot, she replies that her grandson goes in there and hasn't come out yet, and the guards are too busy to look for him. The girl asks her not to worry because they will find him now, to which she says about her grandson. She continues that recently a young lady came to save him after hearing her story, but the girl also got lost. Jessie asks Chuck who the young lady is, not just an NPC, to which he asks discontentedly if she wants him to spoil the quest for her. The blonde frowns and says that she doesn't want him to do that, because it's better for her to find out everything herself and not to tell her, to which the guy agrees not to do that. The two leave, saying that they will soon return with her grandson, to which she asks them to be careful. A scream is heard in the background of a long corridor. Jessie says that there are rats there and fights them off. The rats are cut off one by one. Chuck says that they all hurt and there are still so many of them. The rats run at him, while he says that there is no end to them. The red-haired man looks angrily and uses the summon. Jessie points and asks if there is a basilisk. Chuck turns around in confusion. He sees a crooked snake and says that he is just a baby, but it is definitely a basilisk. Jessie gives the command to eat all the rats. The small mammals are terrified. The basilisk looks at them and licks its lips. The rats run away while some are eaten. The girl looks at him and says that she was not eager to see snakes again after the basilisk dungeon and did not think that she would summon him, but being attacked by rats is much worse. Chuck looks at her and replies that the basilisk is legendary and says that if he knew that she had a basilisk, they would take it with them on hunts, to which she asks again about that thing. The basilisk licks the girl while telling her that frequent summoning is expensive, and he replies that she can increase it to her current level. The girl tries to break free from her pet's embrace. Chuck says that they need to run there. Blood splashes in different directions. Two children look on in horror. The blonde asks them if they are okay, to which she receives a positive answer. Someone's bloody hand rises above them. A huge rat looks at them. The girl closes her eyes. Blood splashes in different directions. She closes her eyes and watches. Chuck hits the creature in the paw with a stick and calls Jessie. He turns around and asks everyone to evacuate first. The girl asks the children to be careful. The young lady thanks her for this. The blonde fades. Jessie looks at the man falling into the garbage in bewilderment. Chuck gets hit in the face. He flies into the same garbage. The red-haired guy grins and thinks that depending on the level of the player who entered the dungeon, the level of the monsters also increases, and notes that he feels pain. The guy frowns with the thought that he needs to finish this as soon as possible. The system notifies about the ability Shadow and Backlight, the skill of the Dark Knight that allows you to teleport behind the enemy and strike with a subsequent turn of the weapon to inflict additional damage. The guy is perplexed while the rat stands behind him. He makes a slashing blow with his paw. Jessie touches the cuts and heals them. She says that the girl should not get up. The young lady takes up the weapon and thanks her for her help. She pulls the bowstring, says that her name is Elaine and she must help them. The system notifies that the player Elaine has joined the team, that she is level 70 in the class of Archer. The blonde is preparing to meet with a lightning arrow. The arrow hits something. The red-haired man is perplexed with the arrow in his forehead until a notification comes that members of the same team do not receive damage from each other. The red-haired man discontentedly asks if she is drunk, to which she replies that it looks like she has not fully recovered. Chuck thinks that Rat has escaped his special ability of the Dark Knight and wonders if she really has such an advanced combat artificial intelligence, which is impossible. Rat swings while he comes to the conclusion that the intelligence evolved on its own. The guy blocks the blow with his sword and understands that this is impossible, because the artificial intelligence of a humanoid model is initially designed differently. Chuck remembers Guy's words that she herself created it of her own free will. The guy grins because he understands that they are all infected with the virus. A fiery arrow flies towards him. It hits Rat in the eye. Jessie is surprised that it hit, to which she replies that at that time she really had not yet had time to fully recover. Chuck notices a dark aura there and uses a dark strike. Rat receives a slashing blow from the Dark Knight. Grandma and grandchildren are reunited. She thanks them with all her heart. Jessie laughs and says that it was a mere trifle. Grandma says that they have been through so much and she was very worried about them. Elaine gives a negative answer because she climbed there in vain without knowing her capabilities and it is her own fault, and if not for these adventurers. She bows and continues that she and the children would have stayed inside, and she thanks her again. Jessie says that they wanted to help and asks her not to blame herself. Elaine also thanks her, saying that she realized that blind kindness without accompanying capabilities can cause even more harm. She goes around the corner asking to be careful and that they will see each other soon, to which Jessie says that this NPC is important in the game or not, to which she receives in response that she is one of the key heroines. The red-haired man continues discontentedly that he finds it funny that new players immediately understand that she is an important character, to which she is perplexed. The guy continues that when they created the main NPCs, they attracted real actors to capture the movements. He recalls how the development took place and continues that with the growing popularity of the game, the actors who played important NPCs also became famous and the actress playing Elaine suddenly became famous, and now she is super popular. He says that in any case, as the quests are completed, she will still see her, while the system notifies that the dungeon rat lair was successfully protected, and the scenario quest called The Great Adventure Begins Small was also completed. Jessie closed her mouth in surprise and says that the level has increased and she was just a little short of experience, to which she receives in response that the bonus is 1.5 times plus scenario quests always have a lot of experience as a reward. The blonde smiles and agrees. The plot reports that a new story quest has opened called Goblin Raids, and its current goal is to protect the goblins in the forest. Elaine says that she will also help him, while the blonde is perplexed. The notification says that they are now doing the quest Hunter's Problems, where the main goal is to clear the territory of Grey Wolves, where Elaine also decided to join. Another scenario quest about the request of the Cemetery Keeper, where the current goal is to destroy a squad of undead. The undead were pierced through. Jessie asks if this is all, to which he replies that it was too easy. Elaine says that they must be careful, because there is still someone here, while the guy was already starting to get bored because he thought that she would not come. The man in the hood calls them fools and commands them to accept death by bowing before him. The undead were inspired. He gives the command to rise. The undead form a huge monster while someone notices its abomination. Jessie is horrified. She trembles and says that this is an incredible abomination and she is really scared and asks to get rid of it quickly, while he gives a negative answer so that she can figure it out herself. She asks in the background of the monster what is the weakness of the undead, to which she receives in response that in holy magic and clarifies that there are most of the spells of the priest healer. Jessie is surprised to think about holy magic. Chuck smirks and says that she can go and cure this poor guy and see how many growths he has. The girl goes to the monster. The undead look at her and she trembles. The healer is horrified and wonders if the treatment can really work. That's how this video ends. If you have sat through to the end, please don't forget to press the subscribe button and leave feedback. See you in the next video.